Hello, my name is Guli Francis Dechani and I'm the Bishop of Chelmsford. And I'm delighted to have been asked to record this short talk for our School Leaders Conference today. I'm only sorry that I can't be there with you in person, but I am looking forward to getting to know many of you in the coming weeks and months. Since I started as Bishop of Chelmsford in the spring, I've been taking time to meet with a wide range of people, to understand the culture of the diocese, and to listen and learn about the challenges and the opportunities that we face. One thing I've been certain of from the very start is that our schools are at the heart of our diocesan family, and our school's ministry is a top priority. Last month, I was formally seated as the Bishop of Chelmsford in Chelmsford Cathedral, and I was delighted that teachers and pupils from across the diocese were able to play such an integral role in that service. That meant a great deal to me, and it's indicative of the warm welcome that I've received from our schools and school leaders, for which I'm immensely grateful. The last 18 months have been hugely challenging for our churches, our schools, and the communities that we serve. Your response to these challenges is a cause of great encouragement, as you've sought to care for, teach, and support our children through the most extraordinary of times. And you've done an incredible job. I know how difficult and exhausting it's been for school leaders, for teachers, staff, and pupils alike. You have been on the front line of the pandemic. And even now, as restrictions are being eased, COVID-19 is once again sweeping through some of our school communities, and that will be causing anxiety and great uncertainty. So my hope is that today's conference will provide you with a little space to reflect, to spend time with colleagues, and to share something of your experiences together. And I'm really pleased to see that one of the three topics that you'll be focusing on is well-being, both for staff and for children. And I want, if I may, to take the opportunity to say something about your well-being as school leaders. You, of course, understand your own context and challenges far better than I do. But like you, I work in a role that could consume every hour of every day. And sometimes it's tempting to follow that path rather than to try to look after yourself. But as leaders, we have a responsibility not only to care for ourselves, but also to model good practice for those around us. People will notice what we do much more than what we say. Since I've been Bishop of Chelmsford, I've become acutely aware of the pressures and the strains on leaders in our churches and schools. And I encourage you to find rest and peace amidst the busyness, to make time for it. This is something I take very seriously myself, and amongst other things, I'll be making space once a quarter to go on a retreat day, to pray, to reflect, and to find some refreshment. The other two topics you're discussing today, diversity and inclusion and care for our planet, also reflect significant challenges facing the church, our schools, and wider society. In the church, we're grappling with issues of identity, sexuality, relationships, and marriage through the living in love and faith process. Meanwhile, the movement towards greater racial justice following the murder of George Floyd in the US has sparked the church, like so many other organizations and institutions, into a period and process of self-examination and reflection. In Chelmsford Diocese, our Racial Justice Task and Finish group is close to reporting on a series of findings and to offer recommendations to help us address racial injustice in the church and in our communities. And I'm pleased that education and schools are an integral part of that report, and I'm grateful to school leaders for your contribution. It is vital that the Racial Justice Task and Finish group and the National Church of England's report From Lament to Action that these result in meaningful and effective action after so many failed attempts to tackle racial injustice in the Church of England. It's also important that we think of these reports and the Living in Love and Faith process not so much as initiatives, but as how we express our care for one another and how we live well together in a spirit of thankfulness to God. And the same can be said about our relationship to the planet that God has given us. And this, of course, is an area where our children and our schools have so much to teach us. It's been an inspiration to see children in our church schools taking a lead. Climate change will have a far greater impact on them than it will on us, and they deserve to be heard. So I thank you for giving them a voice. And it's a matter of considerable pride that it's one of our own Chelmsford Diocesan Church schools that's been selected by the government to record a message for school children across the UK and for global leaders ahead of the COP26 conference in Glasgow at the end of this month. So my best wishes to all involved in that. Today's conference is about meeting these challenges of well-being, diversity and inclusion, and caring for God's creation as we prepare pupils for the world that they will experience as adults. And so I'd like to close, if I may, with a prayer for you as school leaders as you embark on this journey together. God of new beginnings, we thank you for those who lead our schools. We ask your blessing that they may have wisdom and strength in the leadership that they exercise. Bless our schools, our churches and wider communities, so that in work and play we may grow in respect and trust for one another and for you. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ, who brings the promise of new life and love to all. Amen. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
Thank you, Bishop Guli. We embark on our programme now. And as Bishop Guli said, we're focusing on these three areas and starting off with the first verse 1, as it were, which is to think about racial justice and inclusion. And of course, that has a resonance for us because dignity, respect, community, and living well together is part of what we do. So it's great to welcome Allana, and on screen you can see where she has come from and is coming from in what she has to say to us this morning.
Well, I don't think I could go in for a better musical welcome. I can imagine myself just walking down the aisle, with a bit of Bob Marley playing in the background. Thank you very much, Tim. I appreciate that, your invitation to be here today, and I appreciate the time to spend with all of you, telling you and speaking to you and getting us to think about what we do as schools for racial justice. My name is Allana. I founded the BMed Network, co-founded it with some friends 4 years ago. And since then, we've been working on how we can make change happen within education. And that's really important and significant for us. Why is it important and significant? Well, because change is something that needs to happen. And when we speak of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to make sure that we're focused on everyone that's around us and that we're giving our children the best opportunity to be the best version of themselves. But how does that happen when you have institutions that have espoused race and racism for such a long time? And it's become so automatic that it becomes systematic. So I'm hoping that through our time that we spend today, I get you thinking about the institution that you work for, thinking about where we are within this entire process and our roles as leaders, and what we should be imparting in our schools and how well we do that, and the imperative to make that change happen so that we do become schools for racial justice in itself. So first I want us to think about, well, what is that model of education that we work with? What is it we're actually looking at? Well, first we need to think about education system and how it is built as an institution. So every institution has their embedded ideals. So you have the embedded institutions from which we have beliefs, customs, and norms. And if you think of the European origins of education, you'd realize that the first schools that were invented and the first mass education programs that were put in place were dealt in order for us to have control. They were made in order for us to institutionalize, to have people doing specific functions in the manner that we desired. So the beliefs and customs and norms established those and allowed those to happen. And that was then set in place by the institutional environment. So that's space in which we work. And that comes from our government structures. So we see it feeding through our politics. We see it feeding through our economy. We see it feeding through the laws that we're able to pass and the ones that we ignore, the ones that we apply and the ones that we pay less attention to. And even though we change government in itself, the change of structures is very limited. And within that limitation, you have an upholding of the embedded institutions, because those beliefs, customs, and norms carry through no matter the political party, no matter who is in charge of the police service, no matter who is in charge of the financial status of our society. Those beliefs, customs, and norms are embedded and become a part of our normalized lives. And then we fit in. Is we make those institutional arrangements that are going to allow these norms and beliefs and customs to become a part of entrenched learning. So it's about the governance that we have and the profession that we are. So let's consider our role as part of the teaching profession. As a part of our role, we spend a disproportionate amount of time sharing knowledge, selected knowledge that has been selected on our behalf by the institution that governs us and the institutional environment we work within. And we then respond to that by shaping that knowledge into something that will be accepted by the individuals that we serve. So our society and our community. How we make that happen is up to us. But what we choose to share and the manner in which we share it, well, that's pretty much set for us. And there are lots of different ways to coerce and make sure and ensure that we follow the model and the systems that are set in place. So then you're saying, well, Allana, okay, so if that's how institutions work, and when we speak of institutional racism, we're actually talking about the beliefs and the customs and the norms that have been built into our model of education. Then to make things change, you need to change the institutional environment. It's not down to us, it's down to them. They are the ones who have to make change happen. Well, to their credit, they tried. In 1977, let's go through a little history of education now. In 1977, there was a report called the West Indian Community, and that was done by the Common Select Committee, and it was in response to race relations at the time. And based on that report, a committee of inquiry was set up. And that committee of inquiry was tasked with finding out about the education that children from ethnic minority groups were able to get at that point in time, and to see what was happening inside of an education system that didn't allow equity and equality to happen. Now, there was a report that came out from this, and that report is called West Indian Children Are in Our Schools. And that was done by Anthony Rampton. Now, that report is really interesting because in that report, it concluded that there were two real main areas that allowed West Indian children to fail. One is that there were very low expectations from their teachers. So the teachers did not have any high expectations of achievement, and therefore those children were put to the side. And secondly, there was racial prejudice, and he named it, racial prejudice among white teachers and among our society. Hence, these children are not achieving. Well, you can imagine the uproar that it created at that point in time. And as any good government would do, they sacked him. They said, out you go, Anthony Rampton, and they brought in a man called Lord Michael Swan. And he worked on the same issue and produced another report in 1985. So we're now on to our third report. And that report is something that we are still working on today. Now, hands up if any of you know the contents of that report. I'm looking at everybody whose video is on. Any hands up? Okay, let's go through in a little while. The first part is that fundamental change is necessary. And Swan emphasized in his first 3 recommendations about the education for all children, that limiting change on race and racism, limiting that to just the people that it affects is going to be an ineffective method. So he said, we have to learn how to educate all our children about how Britain is a multiracial and multicultural society. The challenge is for all of us, whether we're in Chelmsford, whether we're an independent school, whether we're a university, the challenge is for all of us, despite our circumstance, to make sure that race and racism is an issue for all schools and all pupils. But then he went even further, and in the next group of recommendations, he has stated that education has to be something more than the reinforcement of beliefs, values, and identity which each child brings to school. So we're going to pause there and we're going to have a point of reflection. Because when we think of certain parts of the diocese, one of the things you will hear is, yes, but we're predominantly white area and my school is predominantly white, so this doesn't really affect us. How should we be tackling this? When those children bring ideas from home, how should we be tackling this? Education has to be something more than the reinforcement of the beliefs, values, and identity which each child brings to school. And that's where our call to be schools for racial justice comes from. Because if we're going to combat racism, we need to tackle the myths. If we're going to bring multicultural understanding, we have to have it as a core part of the school, not as an add-on at the end of the day, but anti-racism has to be integrated to every single structure. It has to be a golden thread that weaves its way throughout your entire school. In everything that you're doing, it needs to be a consideration. Now, Swan said exactly the same as Rampton and said it with emphasis. And at that point, the government or the governance said, well, we don't think we're well placed to fix this. It's really bad. Yes, it's really, really bad. And moved on to more reports. And I can give you, there are far more reports than they are listed here. And I can give you an entire list of all of these reports. But through all of these reports, the things become clear. Reports are just that, reports. They tell you exactly where you are at this point in time. What they aren't are actions. And because we never moved from reporting to action, there was never any change made. So when we look at the history of racial justice within UK education, we're in exactly the same position that we were, probably slightly better, because we're now holding the discussion among the grassroots. But the actual institutional change that we need to make is now 36 years on from the Swan Report, not in place. And part of that comes from the manner in which we choose, and our governance and the institutional environment chooses to make change happen. So what you're going to hear from me today is we are in need of a revolution. We are going to bring the education revolution. We are going to make it happen. Because when you go down the list of reports, you can see a change in the tone of the report with the final one that has come out for us. And that's the Sewell Race Report. Now, within that report, there are 4 overarching recommendations, which, to be fair to the report, make absolute sense. If we want to have a society where we have racial justice that occurs, then we have to build trust between different communities and institutions. We have to promote greater fairness so that there are improved opportunities for all. We have to create agency so that people feel that they have a sense of belonging and therefore are active participants and active citizens. And we have to achieve genuine inclusivity. So the report isn't all bad, but the report is terrible. Absolutely terrible. Because the basis from which they work is not so much about how do we change our institutions, but how do we check that people understand what our institutions are doing. Not so much how do we change the beliefs and the culture and the aims and the ideologies that we had from years ago to encompass our modern world, but instead, how can we get people to understand that those are the beliefs and the ideologies and the occurrences that we have from years ago, and that's the ones they should really put trust in. And we're going to check that they actually are working really well. So while the Sewell Report gives us really good ideas, such as geography and focus groups being the basis for additional funding, and that being analyzed on a regional basis, and ethnic pay gap reporting, the idea that having more controls and having more governance over the experiences of others is what's going to make cohesion happen is absolutely absurd. But that's the report that's endorsed by the government. And why is it endorsed? Well, in the same way that Rampart was rejected, if there is an issue that seems too large to fix, the best way to fix it is to have inaction. Allow the paralysis to come forward and then have change happen on a minor scale so that you're seen to be doing something, but don't change the core. What I'm going to say to all of you today is we need to change the way that we see our systems, and we need to understand the issue really well and then get our response right. So let's get our heads settled in for the next 20 minutes, because we're going to start to understand the issue really well, learn more as we go forward, and then think about how can we get the response right. Because instead of this model where we have all of these ideas, beliefs coming down to us and being institutionalized through our arrangements and through our profession and the way that we are trained and the way that we train our students, we need to see a model of rebellion in education that is going to take the individual behaviors and the ideas from our students, those children who understand anti-racism, those children who understand the community and the society they want to live in the future, and build it into a part of our institutional arrangements. We need to change the way we teach, change what we are teaching, change the way we recruit, change what we believe a leader looks like, what we believe a strong teacher looks like, and we need to give ourselves agency, take it in that manner. so that we force a change in the institutional environment. And then, and only then, will we have changed beliefs and customs and norms that allow us to have justice, racial justice, within education itself. And that is something that is incredibly difficult. It's easy to talk about, as we know with all of the reports, but it's incredibly difficult to put all of those actions into, put all of those ideas into action, and to make sure that it's a part of what we're doing to create change. So let's start. First, we need to understand the system and understand what we're talking about. So when we speak about institutional racism or systemic change, we need to have an understanding of, well, what are the different factors that are joining together to make this happen? So let's look at ourselves as individuals, and then let's look at the system within which we work. As an individual, I want you to pause and think, what is my belief about my racial identity? What is my personal belief about my racial identity? How conscious am I of my racial identity? And how often do I need to be conscious of my racial identity? Now I want you to think, well, what is it that I perceive from others in that interpersonal space? What is it that I perceive from others about my racial identity and its place within society? What are the things that happen within the interactions I have at work, the interactions I have at home, the interactions I have at church? What do those interactions teach me about the way my racial identity is perceived? And now let's think, now that I've had, and this is just the beginner, I know you need far more time than I'm giving you right now, but now that I have some sense, basic grasp of my individual and what the interpersonal might be, what is it that I see at an institutional level? So let's go start with your schools. So as I walk around my school, what is it that I see that has been shared about various racial identities, starting with your own? What are the beliefs and the ideas that are shared? And how are they reinforced? And now I want you to think, through that reinforcement, how many times are those ideas repeated? So when a child enters, when you enter the school building, and then you go to a lesson, is there reinforcement there? Is there reinforcement when you step into the assembly hall? Is there reinforcement in the type of play that is taken to be appropriate to your school? Is there reinforcement in the lunch that is served and in what is served? Is there reinforcement in the level of interaction that there is? Is there reinforcement in seeing the leadership team that there is across the school and seeing the teaching team and the middle leaders and then seeing the cleaners across the school? What is it that's being reinforced when that child leaves my school or when I leave my school and I go out into my wider community? Because that's the journey you go on when you start thinking of being anti-racist as an individual and understanding your identity in society, to understanding when there is systemic change and what that looks like in society. Because if, when I go to school, when I am out in the community, when I am interacting with the police, when I go to my doctor, when I go to my church, if there is a predominant racial identity that is taken in only a negative light, or that is pushed to the side and ignored, and there's a single system that is dominant. That is when we speak about having systemic racism within our society. When we see it within our education sector, it's our institutional racism. When we see it within the police force, that's our institutional racism. How we reinforce it as a profession, whether it's within our exclusion statistics, whether it's in our choices in the curriculum, whether it's in what we decide that we're going to have as our entry point data and have as our entry point criteria, that's our structural parts. And all of these things together, what we need to consider before we can embark on if we're going to truly and honestly look at how we deliver in education. I'll tell you this, when you look at the statistics, we know that there is an imbalance. So when we look across the percentages of students within schools across England, we know that there's at least 34% that are of minority ethnic heritage or have been racialized as minority ethnic. Yet, when we look across our schools, we don't see those same percentages. And that becomes even worse when we move into leadership. Because if you're white British, you have an increased chance of becoming a head teacher and a deputy head teacher. But if you are visibly of ethnic minority heritage, then you're less likely to become a head teacher or any senior leader within schools in England. So there's no equity in our system. There's no equality in our system, because surely the percentages should even themselves out. But as we see time pass, and I've just taken 2016 to 2018, you can see that there's relatively small change that's happening. A difference of probably 3 or 4 head teachers, a difference of 3 or 4 teachers in the system. And that's what we need to look at, because we cannot continue with an education system where we have 84%, 85% of teachers becoming 93% of the head teachers within schools. It shows that we need to make change happen, and we need to be open to making change happen. And that is a challenge, especially if you're racialized as white. Because what is effectively being said to you is some of the power that the belief systems and the norms within our institutions have allowed to grow, some of that needs to be given up, and you need to choose to give that up. You need to choose to be more open than the belief systems and the norms and the institutional environment have created. So when we speak of that inequality, we have to get our language right. And we know inequality is pretty much one person has access, the others don't. But when we speak of equality, we're talking about, well, how do we ensure that everybody gets equal help to get access? That's insufficient in our current system, and it doesn't bring us any closer to justice. But equality does make us feel good about ourselves. So we feel good because we've done something. So no one can accuse us of not having an action. I've done an action. I've given them both the same ladder. So therefore, I've done something to help. But when we get to a system where our schools can operate with equity, we now look at how do I give some students more or give some teachers more support than others, and that's okay. That's fine, because I have a culture within my school where we understand why that is happening. We understand why equity is needed. And then ultimately, what we're aiming for to be schools of justice, where we don't look at, well, how can I adjust the person? Instead, we say, how can I unbreak the system? So instead of fixing the child who's reaching for the apple, just fix the tree, because the tree is the issue. And our education system is the issue, because we have norms and policies that need to ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities. And we need to be able to appreciate the presence of diversity. And we need to know that people, inclusion and true sense of inclusion comes when people feel like they belong, when they're valued, and when they're empowered, which means that we listen when they speak their minds. And ensuring that they're all a part of this is really significant for us to do. And we need to take our school cultures on a journey. And I'm going to have you reflect a little bit on this. Now, it's okay to make a start, but it's about where we are aiming and what we're aiming for. So coincidentally, I'm speaking to you on 1st of October, the start of Black History Month. I personally do not like Black History Month, but I understand that it serves a function. It serves as a starting point for those who have never had to consider a race other than their own. And I expect that all of your schools will have some level of celebration of Black History Month, because it promotes equity. It brings into our education system an idea that, look, here are all of these other people who contributed to building the Britain that we have right now. And that is wonderful as a starting point. But if 3 years from now, the only presence that we have of a decolonized curriculum and a diversified curriculum is Black History Month in your school, then you're not on the journey. You're still in the starting blocks. Because the embedding of all of these ideas into the culture, again, the golden thread that needs to run through has to be the means by which we accelerate equity. So it's not about promoting equity on its in sense, it's about how do we accelerate it? Because if we can accelerate equity, we can become schools for justice. It's not so much about how do we celebrate diversity, but how do we cultivate it? How do I ensure that every single student and every single ethnicity and every single race within my school, and those who aren't within my school, still have a place within my school and still belong within my school? We're not fostering inclusion anymore. We have a culture where all of our students, staff, and community understand our inclusion culture, that we value everyone, that we empower everyone, and that they all belong to our school. So my first part to you, we started thinking about your own racial identity and what part it plays. And I think this is a really significant step that schools tend to skip over, because for all the time that I've been having these conversations as a part of BayMed, I have lots of schools that go, yeah, but what can we do in the curriculum? What can we change instantly? What sticky plaster can I put over everything to try and make it all better? Just give me that. And we don't spend enough time understanding, what can I do to change the culture of my school? How can I make that culture something that's really important to everyone in my school and everyone in my community, and even make it important to everyone who's a part of the institution, the community in itself? And that comes from spending enough time reflecting on your own racial identity and how it fits into our modern UK society, how it fits into our institution of education. Where is the sense of equity, whether you're the person who's getting a slightly taller ladder, or whether you're the person who's getting a slightly shorter one, and understanding where you fit in terms of equity, and considering how that makes you feel, and stopping to acknowledge that emotional response. How do I make sure that there are multiple identities that are not just represented in my organization as they walk around the building, but also through the books, through the materials, through every interaction that my students are having and that I'm having? How do I ensure that there's a sense of inclusion that brings in perspectives and lets every individual know that when you say something to me, I am listening, not just hearing you, I am listening deeply? Because those are the things that are going to build in to your sense of belonging within your school, within this profession. And then that will allow you to want to share that sense of belonging to everyone else, and understanding how that equity works in itself, how that inclusion works, and how we bring diversity into our schools. Second point that I'd like you to reflect on would be, well, how do you evaluate your recruitment and promotion? So let's stop for a minute and focus on our staff, because when we do our recruitment, one of the most fascinating things about recruitment in our institution is that we're told what to look for. And it's really subtly reinforced. So when we say Russell Group universities, that's the shortlist. When we say First, that's the shortlist. When we say Mr. Brown, that's the shortlist. But when we look deeply at why and how we shortlist, do we spend so much time looking at the people who had a really strong structured ladder that allowed them to elevate really rapidly? Or do we spend enough time looking at the people who needed to navigate something that was far more difficult? Because intrinsically, their leadership skills are probably just as good as the person who had a much smoother ladder to climb. But when we look at them on paper and when we look at our recruitment methods, do they actually make sense? One of my friends works for Save the Children. She's the head of recruitment there. And one of the recent changes she has proposed to her management is, let's get rid of the cover letter. That personal statement tells you nothing. Because when you're reading the personal statement, it's just somebody waffling on about what they sort of think they can do for your school. Instead, why don't you set a task for that person? And from that task, look at how they respond to it. Look at how they share their ideas around it, and look at what they embed into it, and use that to help us recruit. Now, I will say, I stopped and I looked at her and I went, what? I'd never think of that in a million years. But as I reflect upon it, it makes so much more sense. How can I change the way I look at recruitment so that I'm giving everyone a really fair chance, a just chance of demonstrating how they think as a leader than by giving them a leadership task? So it's not about only what have you done, but it's about what you have, showing me what you have the potential to do. And in doing so, you'd find that in changing your practice, people who you wouldn't consider before, who, if we look at statistics, are far more likely to not have attended a red brick university, are far more likely to have had a much rougher ride around education itself. Those people are now given a chance to show what they've learned and to show the resilience and the personal skills they've built. We also need to consider where we tend to put those ceilings. Where do we put a ceiling on a person and say, this is as far as I think you can go, this is as much as I see in you? And where do we instead help to remove those barriers so that people can flourish and show us exactly what they can do? And finally, how do we actually think about people who are on the cliff edge and were on the cliff edge and had to climb back up? So whether it is that they had a break, whether it is that they changed from one phase to another, or whether they're returning from maternity. How do we ensure that we still value their skills, we understand the struggles that they would have gone through, and we ensure that we're not the ones that are going to push them off the cliff? Instead, we pull them back up, we reset them, and we allow them to start building their careers again, instead of simply discarding them from our schools. Our third area we're going to think about today is going to be about how we evaluate the curriculum delivered. Now, within the curriculum, there are many different elements. And first, I'm going to tell you about diversifying versus decolonizing. Now, when we say diversify the curriculum, all you're doing is adding diverse characters into the curriculum. Hopefully, diverse characters of quality. I always tell the story of when I read the book Gregory Cool. So I'm from the island of Trinidad, and the perception of Gregory Cool, if you've not read it, is this little island boy who's coincidentally from Trinidad, running around barefooted with all the chickens, etc. And his cousin comes from the US, a nice Western country, and has all of this cool clothing and trainers on his feet, etc. And Gregory goes through this realization of the differences between himself and his cousin. Now, it's a diverse character. It is a Black character raised on an island. It gives the children a window into another experience. But if that's the only book you're going to share, or if Hen is the only book you're going to share, where there's a child who's walking through the grass, the long grass, and animals are eating fruit from off of her head, then you need to think about, well, what's the stereotyping that I'm putting in place, and what am I going to do to combat that? Because that's insufficient diversity within a curriculum. It doesn't help to decolonize. And decolonize is about bringing a different way of thinking. How do I get various perspectives to fit in on the same topic? How do I get them to show that there's differences in thought depending on your perspective? So when we evaluate our curriculum, we need to look at all of these elements. And David Sadker has done some analysis of this. And in his analysis, he talks about, well, what is it that we're tending to do? Are we giving a single perspective? Or are we decolonizing, giving many various perspectives on what's happening? Do we ignore racism? Do we say that it's invisible? Because the thing about invisibility is that that makes an impression and it leaves a gap. We spend a lot of time thinking about the gaps in knowledge, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the gaps that we leave in impressions. And those gaps get filled the same way that our gaps in knowledge do. They'll either be filled by someone else in an incorrect manner, or we'll make assumptions about what we think should be happening. How do we ensure that we're not isolating groups based on what the text that we're using are common choices of mice and men? If you are still using that book and you're still saying, well, I need to use this book because it has a really strong authorial tense within it, then my question to you is, if since the time of the writing of that book, there has been no other book that has brought about a real change in education and the perception of authorship and writing, then pretty much what we're doing in teaching English isn't working. Because surely there is another author that says and can construe a message in a far more sensitive way that isn't hurtful to specific groups. We all know about linguistic bias because that's something that comes through, whether it's within an accent that we hear, the manner in which someone intonates, and their ability to speak English. But I think probably the worst of them is the cosmetic bias, the one where there is the illusion of equity. And we see it around us all the time, whether it is through the adverts where we suddenly have very much mixed families. We see the photographs across the wall where you have lovely range of beautiful mixed children. Mix of diversity is happening everywhere. But then when you come into the actual environment, because of the lack of culture, there is no real sense of belonging or place that happens. And this is very much about the exclusion of various groups. So we need to ensure that when we're looking at our curriculum and we're reviewing it in depth, we are looking for all of these forms of bias and strengthening our curriculum by addressing each of these points individually. And we're not, luckily for us, or unluckily for us, Wales is going to be the trailblazer, because from today, they've become the first UK nation to make the teaching of histories and experiences mandatory as a part of the school curriculum. And that in itself started as a grassroots movement. It started with the individuals telling the people who are the gatekeepers and the professions, this is not what we want. And they then triggered a change that allowed the environment to change. I'd love to say that we're close to this in England, but judging from our current DFE, probably not going to happen anytime soon. So hence, I'm here speaking and asking all of you to reflect on where you are, because we are at the profession stage, whereas Wales has already moved into their institutional environment stage. But we can still make change happen, because some of the institutions that you're a part of, such as the church, are well aware of the changes that need to happen. And they've made this a priority through their reporting and their call to action. So the next question is, how are you contributing to the community that is causing this change to happen? How are you and your partners within the diocese? How are you and your partners within the Church of England itself, education sector? How are you working together to make this change happen? And how are you spreading it so that it's not only the Diocese of Chelmsford, but Ipswich, Norwich, all of the others join in on this journey? So I'm going to recap, and I'm going to allow you some time for reflection and thinking with colleagues. Under the 4 sections: your identity and belonging. How do you regard your own racial identity and the racial identity of others? How do you evaluate, recruit, and promote when you're looking at your staffing? How do you evaluate the curriculum that you deliver to students every day? And how do you contribute to ensuring that there is a community of change? Because if you're able to strengthen and build on these 4 areas, then you will be well on your way to that journey for schools of racial justice. So I'm going to end there and ask for you to be set into breakout rooms so that you can have a much deeper discussion with colleagues.
Welcome back, everybody. We're going to take a break now for 15 minutes. So leave your machine on, but you might want to stop your video. And just to draw your attention to using the chat as we move through the day, please do put things in there, or have conversations within the chat, because it's very difficult online to talk to each other face to face, but we can do that through the chat. So we come back in 15 minutes at 30:30, and Aleishia will then take us on to a summary and share with us some things that are happening in this diocese into the near future. But before we do that, I just want to, on all our behalf, say a really warm and strong thank you to Allana for kicking us off today and for this input. Allana's become a great friend of the Church of England over the last year, and contributed to loads of things up and down the country. So it's good to have you with us in Chelmsford, and we're really grateful for the input, which has all been recorded, so we'll be able to cascade some of that learning down into the future. Thank you, Allana, and have a good coffee break.
Yes, my name is Aleishia Lewis. I'm Deputy Head here at St Mary's Prittlewell in Southend. That's my main job. I'm also seconded 2 days a week to the Church of England as a programme lead for new MPQs, which is very exciting. But I'm also really proud to be a member of the Chelmsford Diocese DBE, and working alongside Tim and Carrie and some of the others that I know are here today. And I'm also representative for BAME Ed East. So Allana kind of heads up, alongside 2 others, BAME Ed as the official organisation, but we also have regional groups within that. So myself and 2 others, Lorraine and Charlie, who are in Norwich and Norfolk, head up BAME Ed East, and I'll be explaining to you all a bit more about that organisation this morning. So what Tim asked me to come along and to talk to everyone about was really how we are doing all this kind of things that Allana started to talk to you about this morning in the Diocese of Chelmsford. And I'll be really honest, how I came to all of this was in the year 2018-19. I was part of the church school leadership course that Tim spoke about at the very beginning. And I found myself sitting there in a room of 20-25 people, and it dawned on me yet again that I was the only person there that was not white. And so that weekend I sat at the hairdressers and I Googled the workforce statistics, which Allana shared with you in her session earlier, and came across the staggering figure that at that time in 2018, I was actually one of 100 deputies or assistant heads with my mixed race heritage. And that was absolutely astounding. And it spoke volumes to me, actually, and kind of put me on a platform that I've been on ever since, really trying to make a difference within our diocese and beyond. And I'll be really honest, everyone else in that group did their projects on really valuable things in our church schools, like prayer gardens and praying with children and sharing your vision. And I did mine about how there are not enough ethnic minority leaders in our schools, which was very different to everyone else's presentations. But it then led to some of the work that I've been doing later on, which I will talk to you about, alongside the work that we are doing within the diocese. Just over a year ago, I kind of utilised my burdening relationship with Tim, and I said to Tim, look where we are, look what's happening, it's time, I've had enough, we need to make a change, we need to be part of a difference. And I said that in Tim's capacity, I needed him to help me, because being very honest, here in Southend, we're in our own authority, we're the only church school in the authority, but we are part of the Diocese of Chelmsford. And in the 5 years I've worked at St Mary's, apart from the other teachers here, I've never met another teacher of an ethnic minority background within the diocese. And so I said to Tim, I'd like to get some teachers together, leaders, whoever you know out there in the same situation as me, just to come together for a conversation, which we did at the end of July 2020. We have met half-termly ever since then. And really excitingly, we are actually at the point now of Tim spurred us on and said, I think this should become an official association. And so we are now at the point of launching our Diocese of Chelmsford Global Majority Education Association. And as part of that, we have got some aims, which I'm going to share with you now. So we do aim as an association to establish a coalition of global majority teachers, leaders, and other professionals who are directly and indirectly involved in the educational process. We want this to be an association for everybody. We don't just want it to be for teachers, for senior leaders. We think it's also important that our LSAs, who are global majority heritage, also have the opportunity, or anyone within education, whether they are in SEN, whether they are in educational psychology, anything that they think resonates with them, we want them to be part of it. The other aim of the association is to create a forum to actually be together, to exchange ideas, to exchange strategies, but at the heart of it is improving the outcomes and our opportunities for our global majority educators and our pupils. And that's all of our pupils flourishing, but particularly those who may be marginalised in our education system at the moment. And also it's to identify and support and develop those in the diocese who may wish to assume leadership positions in the future. And that is something that is particularly something I'm really passionate about, and I'll talk to you a bit more again in a moment. But obviously sponsored by the DBE, it is our mission and our purpose through the association to achieve these primary areas of focus, which involve mentoring, involves development programmes to strengthen the skills and the confidence of people working in our schools, and really to developing anti-racist schools and curricula through collaboration. Allana spoke to you earlier about diversifying and decolonising the curriculum. And the reality is we have to move forward with our language now. It's not enough for people to say we're not racist. As a school, we do this, and as a school, we do this, and we have anti-racist week and we have anti-bullying week. It's not about that anymore. People have been teaching racism for such a long time. It's actually about what is each and every one of us doing to be actively anti-racist. And that is a very different thing. But it's about working together. And what I have found from working with schools within our diocese and schools nationally is that some people really feel like they're out on their own and they don't know how to begin. And this is huge, it is overwhelming, but it's going to be never ending. This is not something you can just do and tick a box. It's ergonomic, it's organic, and it will keep moving on for as long as there are children in our schools. And so the more that we can work together and collaborate, that will really bring power to the work that we are doing and develop confidence in those delivering it. And another one of our purposes and our missions is to actually encourage the voice of pupils and teachers to be heard and to be actioned. Too often in this work, there is what happens to the phrase by Mark Rowland, who does a lot with disadvantage in Essex. He says about assessment, not assumption. And quite often, and lots of this work is kind of steered by people who are assuming what they think is happening. And actually what we need to do is really talk to our pupils, talk to our staff, hear the stories of others, make sure that it's all best based in assessment rather than that assumption. Really excitingly that I get to tell every single one of you here today, almost like the elite group, because no one else knows yet, but we are actually having a launch of our association, which is on Monday, the 15th of November. And we've been really lucky to secure Chelmsford Cathedral, which is absolutely a beautiful space and something that would be perfect to launch this. So it is 6:15 to 8:15 on the 15th of November. And I would encourage each and every one of you, please, to attend and be part of it, because this is not just, although obviously the association is kind of deemed around global majority educators, actually this is for every single person that works in a school, because as much as it is about focusing and developing and supporting global majority educators, it is also about our allies, because they have a really powerful, you have a really powerful place to play. And actually, if you want to learn more about the curriculum, if you want to learn more about how you can do this sort of work into anti-racism with your staff, if you want to gain a better understanding of some of the barriers that are around, if you want to be part of the difference, then you need to be part of this event. So I would encourage each and every one of you to come, to bring 2 or 3 others to really show that you are committed to being part of this. So I hope you have written these details somewhere. Oh, governors too, of course, we actually have a bit of a talk going on through the evening. There'll be 3 workshops that will be happening. One will be focusing on the primary curriculum, one will be focusing on the secondary curriculum, and there will also be a bit of a workshop about collective worship and how this work can be actually steered and used with governors as well. So if you think you'd like to turn up, Tim's in charge of organising the nibbles, because we all need a bit of a nibble at 6:15 on a Monday in November. It'd be brilliant to have as many of you there supporting as possible. So something else that we have been doing, and it has already been alluded to, Bishop Guli spoke about it in her reflections at the beginning, is as a diocese, Bishop Roger put us together in the Racial Justice Task and Finish group. And there are more of us than just these pictures here. I couldn't fit everybody on the screen, but here are some faces that may be very familiar to you. And again, we've been meeting since last I think October time actually, working really focusing on areas that we need and that we can develop to think about with racial justice as a primary focus. And we are at the point where we have presented our recommendations to the Bishop's Council. That was very exciting to be part of, but it is about knowing this is so much bigger. And as I said, it's an onion you have to keep on peeling, but it's something we have to keep on focusing ourselves too. And through that focus, we have got some recommendations that the group have put together for education. And these are some of them here. Obviously, the report is not out in full. This is just a little précis of some of the recommendations that were put through the education strand. So it's actually about developing content and curriculum that speaks to the concerns regarding racial justice. And this is about it being embedded in the curriculum. This is not about having it as a bolt-on. This is about it being there and running as a core. The Church of England, obviously as a wider organisation, has started to work on a theological framework for racial justice that could be used in our RE curriculum. And myself and Tim are working alongside the team in the Education Office to develop that a bit further in our schools. And I know that some of the schools in the diocese will be using that to start seeing and putting some work together and see how it goes. But it is about really focusing our curriculum so that it is a curriculum for all of our children, that involves all of them being able to see themselves, believing they can achieve, and also a curriculum that tells wider histories and wider stories. Obviously, another recommendation was about launching the association, which we are now doing on November the 15th. And then the third recommendation is about developing our staff, so recruitment, retention, moving into leadership roles to actually make sure that within our diocese, our schools are reflective of our society that we live in, because as we know, nationally that is a problem, so it will definitely be a problem within our diocese. Other things, if I'm going to do a little personal plug that are going on, after the Church School Leadership Programme, where I kind of steered this work forward, I was really lucky enough 2 years ago to actually receive funding from the Equality and Diversity Fund, which at the time was a government-led initiative, and I was able to source that funding, and I developed a leadership programme with ethnic diversity teachers in mind. I have been lucky enough, although the funding has officially stopped from the DFE, which speaks volumes really. SETSA, who I work with as an SLE, really want me to run the course again, because the 14 teachers that we had on it have gone on to do great things. And so they've really asked me if we could do it again, which we are, and you can see the 4 sessions are there. But if you have got teachers within your schools who you think this would really benefit, then please, the website is at the bottom there, setsa.info. Tim and myself have spoken about how this can work within the diocese, because actually there is no avenue that this should be seen as something that's working against the church school leadership programme. Both those leadership programmes are very different, but they both have about growing great leaders at the core. So if that is something, if you know somebody who this would really appeal to, if this would support within your school, put the details down. You can log on to the SETSA website and you can book a place. It starts in January 2022. I cannot wait to see what we get with this year's cohort. It'll be very exciting. WHSG is Westcliff High School for Girls, so it will be run as day-long courses down here at Westcliff High School for Girls, which is a secondary school, but session 2, which is 1 till 4, will be remotely delivered. We have thought about actually doing the 4 sessions as a hybrid anyway, as we had to when we went into lockdown last year. So if location is something that could be a consideration, as obviously the school is down here in Southend, then the option is there to still be part of it remotely as well. So that's something that may appeal to someone either here on this call or someone that you may know. And as part of it, we do have a lot of coaching, we have mentoring, we also have opportunities to shadow leaders in other schools to really support our school leaders on their journey going forward. And then another thing, I've got a bit of a delay on my clicking. Oh, it's probably going to run about 4 slides at once, but BAME-Ed. So BAME-Ed East of England, as I said before, is one of the regional hubs of the wider BAME-Ed organisation. If you within your school would just like more information, the BAME-Ed website in general is absolute gem. So there's a whole section of recruitment and retention and governors and curriculum. There is everything you could possibly want to find. Speakers that could come into your school, people that can work with your staff or your children. I would implore you and encourage you to look at the BAME-Ed website. But if any of your staff or any of you would like to join our network, you can join our East of England hub. We do have network meetings. We have them every month. We have actually got one next Thursday, so I will put the link to that in the chat if it's something that you would like to be part of. But as part of those sessions, we run training events. We also just have spaces to talk, to be open, to be honest, to share our stories, to vent, or just to go, I'd like some help, please. So that is something that you might be interested in looking up as well. But just to finish, I just wanted to focus you to something from the Called, Connected, Committed document. If you have not read that, it is an invaluable document. There are 24 leadership practices in there which really speak the vision for education that the Church of England has through everything that we do. And that as a document is brilliant at really focusing you all as school leaders into making sure we're thinking about the things we should be thinking about, we're challenging ourselves, but really we have got flourishing at the heart of everything that we do every single day for our staff and for our children. So this is just the reflection that comes from celebrating diversity and enabling flourishing. And I think there is something in here that every single one of us can take. And if it's nothing else, then it's the words of the first sentence, which says, leaders in education cherish diversity and inclusion, recognising that their communities are inherently better and richer in their differences. And we're in the situation that we are in now because we've spent so long teaching everyone that they are the same. And the reality is that we're not the same. We are all very different. But what we need to be doing is celebrating those differences rather than pointing them out or making them something that people are marginalised over. It is about how we are inherently richer for the differences that we all have. So we need to celebrate our learning together. We need to make sure that we're holding our doors open to all of our children and to all of our staff, and that we're unlocking that potential for every single person to flourish. And what I'd really like you to do now, before you go into the next thing going forward, is actually, what are each and every one of you going to do? This is what this today is about, singing a new song. For me, I'd like to know, I think it would be lovely for you to all share with each other, what is something that you can do, one action that you can take from what you've heard from Allana, from what you've heard from me, from what you spoke about in your breakout room. If you could put down something in the chat about one action you are committed to making as a result of what you've heard in this first session, and sharing that with others would be absolutely brilliant. So if you could all do that, would be really grateful. So type in the chat one action that you can take, whether it is attending the event, whether it is looking at the BayMed website, whether it is speaking to someone in your school about their experience, whether it is reading Called, Connected, Committed. What is that one action you can take to actually get a bit further on this journey into enabling all of our children to flourish through diversity and inclusion in our schools? And I'm going to see who will be the first person to jump in there. Heather. Oh, well done, Heather. Her one thing is attending the event and sharing that with all of her schools. Heather, it would be an absolute privilege to have you there. Cannot wait. Reading Called, Connected, Committed, attending the event, brilliant. Find an inspirational speaker to come to school and share their experiences. And that makes such a difference. Hearing people's stories. I tell my stories to people quite openly, and staff here at my school are really growing and developing and sharing and listening to those stories. We as humans learn through the power of story, and hearing things through a different lens is something that is brilliant. Listening to all groups of parents in the school and coming to the event, absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Linda. Discussing curriculum resources, excellent, Alison. And that links back to what Allana said before about really evaluating the curriculum and not just looking at it, but actually saying, is this good enough? And who are we doing this for? West Ham School would love to come and to launch the event. Come along, West Ham School, share the event. I tell you what, Tim, I told you I'd get everyone coming. Look, definitely wearing a ball gown for this event now. But it is lovely to see how you are going to support us and to support all of you within our diocese. That is what this is part of. This is, as a diocese, we need to work together more, share that power of collaboration. And if you want to be part of the association or anything else in the diocese, this is your chance to take over. So thank you so much for being part of today. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions going forward. I want to say thank you for inviting me, Tim, to come along and speak to everyone today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions.
Thank you so much, Aleishia. You've given us lots to think about and really clear actions for us to take forward from your session as well. So I know the 15th of November has gone in my diary and I'm really looking forward to being there. So thank you for sharing all of that this morning. We're going to move into verse 2 now, which is entitled Schools of Wellbeing. We know that wellbeing is always really important to our schools, but never more so than at the moment when we've been through the last 2 years and we still don't know what the future holds. There's still lots and lots of challenges for school leaders to deal with. So this morning we are going to be sharing some case studies with you, and they are going to be from our very own schools in our diocese. So we've got 4 schools today who are going to share the stuff that they're doing on the ground. So it's working and it's in action, and they'll be sharing those experiences with you. Case study 1 this morning will be from Reverend Kate Moore, head teacher at Birch Primary School.
Thanks, Carrie. This feels really weird to do this on screen, after having spent a couple of days with the Diocesan team in a nice conference centre, but I'm going to give it my best shot. If this had a title, it would be called Accidental Wellbeing. So this is something to do primarily with head teacher wellbeing. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about how the consortium that I belong to has done some really proactive work around head teacher wellbeing. So the accidental bit is really how we made contact with a particular advisor. It started off a number of years ago. I was following a column in the Church Times, and I do find the Church Times quite tedious, but I kept looking for a column in particular by a man called Simon Park, who would talk about his ministry, would talk about how he worked with different people in his community. And then I accidentally came across his name as the author of a murder mystery novel. And in this novel, all the suspects have different personality traits from the Enneagram. And I thought, oh, that's the same man whose column I've been following, and thought it was a fascinating book. And then again, quite accidentally, he popped up in my Twitter feed as somebody who led something called the Mind Clinic. And I clicked the link like you do when you're tired. And he spoke about the work he does with individuals and corporation, big communities, big places. And I don't normally do this, but I sent him an email saying, could you help an overtired head teacher? Is that the kind of work you could do? Could you help an overtired head teacher? And I immediately got a response that said, yes, would you like to come and visit? I drove all the way down to the South Coast. And I saw him several times before feeling, actually, this is somebody that really could help me. One of the big clues for me was a simple signal that he had, that when I arrived, I could see another part of his house where I was going to walk through to. And there was always a candle lit. And that just spoke volumes to me about, here was somebody who was preparing for me to arrive. And we had various conversations about the fact that he it's right down on the South Coast, so it's not terribly near. But we had kind of monthly meetings where I could go and talk about just how horrible it is to be a head teacher some days. And I could tell some of the stories about how horrible it is to be a head teacher. And he really helped me concentrate on what would everybody find horrible, but why was I struggling with particular bits of it? And over the months, my personal story kind of emerged, but I really got to a place of feeling slightly calmer. And then at that point, because you do these things as head teachers, I became chair of the consortium of 24 schools up here. And I hadn't told any of my colleagues that I was struggling, because you don't do that, do you? You know, nobody talks to their colleagues and says that they're finding life difficult. But what was happening at the consortium was that every single termly meeting, there was a management meeting first, before then a day with the whole consortium together. And part of the meeting discussion was, how are the head teachers? And term after term, there were stories of people in distress, people not well, people really struggling. And I listened to this, and then I really had to make a big decision at one point. Having listened to this, I felt, actually, I've got a key resource behind me that is keeping my sanity. But if I tell you about it, I'm going to completely expose myself. I'm going to completely give away that I'm nowhere near as on top of things as I've been pretending to be as chair of your consortium. And again, accidentally, I don't know, I just had to make a decision and said, I really struggle, and I can understand why my colleagues are struggling, but I get help here. And my fellow members of the management group, I think, were a little bit stunned. But what I did was say to them, he has helped me hugely professionally. I wonder if he could help us collectively. And we had a discussion as a little management group, and decided that all I had to do was ask him, and that every other bit of the organisation would be brokered by somebody else. So I asked this man, who of course said yes, be delighted to work with a group of head teachers. But then it was entirely up to somebody else to broker when he would come, where it would be, because I simply didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of keep my time with him, nothing to do with anybody else, quite selfishly. And this man over the last couple of years has worked with us as a head teacher group once a term, probably. The first session, he managed it incredibly well for me, in that we met before it started. He checked I was okay, and then we had an agreement that yes, he was going to tell them where the contact had come from. There was no point hiding that I knew this man very well, but I felt safe that he was going to do that. And the first session was incredibly practical for head teachers, because it was entirely about the science of stress. What is going on in your body when you get stressed? And it gave people a really good opportunity. So this consortium, we've worked together for many years, we trust each other, and people were able to go, oh right, that's why my hands shake, that's where I get raging headaches at the end of the week. And there was just a time of real open sharing of, yeah, I'm feeling the stresses. It was a really powerful session, but a session based on, you know, how is your body coping with what you are coping with professionally. We've had quite a few sessions with him and his colleagues since. One very interesting session was about, and I'm struggling to remember exactly how this was labelled, but it was to do with triangles and the triangle of exchange between people and the power dynamic, and how the dynamic changes in your conversations, and your need to be aware of all that. We also had a very interesting session all about the cell that Julian of Norwich used to live in, and how information comes into you, how you do have to deal with the outside world, however horrible the outside world might be being, but where you might be using another window to be resourced by that. He also worked with us very powerfully after one of our colleagues died, and we were able to sit and in a very safe space be held in the conversation about that. I'm not sure where we would have got the help for that in any other way, but he was immensely helpful. And now what happens is, not everybody goes from the consortium. It's not everybody's cup of tea. It's funded and supported by the consortium. But what happens now is we set the agenda. So we will ask him what we want to look at, and we will basically compare with each other, what are the issues, where do we need support, and then he will come to I think we meet at a hotel, so it's nicely away from school, but he will support us in whatever we feel as a group of head teachers we need support for our well-being in our roles. So that I think we have one in about a week's time. Just for the moment they're on Zoom, which is slightly horrible, but it's an hour and a half of getting some proper professional support, because however much the job is brilliant and creative and lovely, it is incredibly stressful. And certainly for me, the means of coping with that has been some one-to-one support, but it's also been very powerfully around being vulnerable with my colleagues and sharing in some vulnerability. So that is what we've brokered. That's what we're using to support each other. Again, as I've said, it's not everybody's cup of tea, but there's a core group within the 24 of us that find it incredibly supportive. And I would thoroughly recommend that resource, that kind of resource, if either individually or if you belong to networks, perhaps as a network resource. And I'm happy to answer any questions about it, but that's what, I don't know, I'm not sure I'd still be sitting in this chair if that hadn't have kind of accidentally emerged.
Thank you, Kate. That's a really valuable example of how a consortium have come together to provide support for head teachers. So we really appreciate you sharing that. If there are any questions, do feel free to continue using the chat function. You can jot things and thoughts down in there. After the next case study, we will have a breakout room as well, so there'll be an opportunity for people to share thoughts and thinking around this. We're going to move on to case study 2 now, which is going to be from Sarah Hurwood, another of our head teachers from Epping Upland Primary School, who are part of the Epping Forest Schools Partnership Trust. So, Sarah, over to you.
Kate, thank you for that. That was really a very honest reflection, and I felt it was kind of quite of a privilege to almost have heard you speak like that. So thank you for sharing that. I'm taking a slightly different stance on kind of how we've worked wellbeing, and essentially I am part of Epping Forest Schools Partnership Trust, which is 16 schools, and I'm looking at the journey that Epping Upland made as having a very strong philosophy about mental health and well-being, and how that has evolved into creating something much wider across the trust. But one of the things I came across the other day was a quote that it feels excellent that we are paying attention to this. The quote said, "What mental health needs is more sunlight, more candour, and more unashamed conversation." And I feel that by having this section, we are giving it some unashamed conversation, which I think is very powerful. I'm talking to you today as head of Epping Upland. I was a facilitator for leading a mentally healthy school, and over the past year, the trust has kind of changed its approach to wellbeing. So I now have the dubious title of a head of wellbeing services for the trust. There's a quote from Desmond Tutu that says, "There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river, and we need to go upstream to find out why they're falling in." And it was a few years ago that Epping Upland did actually look at why children were falling in, or people were falling in, not just children were falling in, and what was behind the difficulties that we were facing. And one of the things I felt was that behaviour is always coming from somewhere, and to understand where behaviour comes from parents, staff and pupils, we needed to understand how life was for them and how they were feeling, which obviously alludes quite a lot to kind of mental health and well-being. So one of the first things we did, which at the time was considered quite bold, was we employed a wellbeing mentor, and that obviously had a cost attached to it. And initially my governing body and my teaching staff were kind of quite challenging of this and thinking that it potentially was a lot of money to spend on what would she do all day. But we employed Karen, and I would say now that out of every single member of staff that we employ, and I include myself in this, if she's not in school, we notice it. Because her role is now so valuable, because she frees up a lot of teacher time, so they're not spent dealing with issues that are occurring while they're trying to teach. It frees up some of my time because the parents will go to her as their first port of call. So she has a very wide and varied role, but she's basically a listener for the children and as it has evolved, the parents. One of the things that just as an anecdotal example of how she works is she does the gate every morning, and sometimes she's a little bit of a confessional for the children. And a couple of weeks ago, one of our children who she has two parents, police, who are quite strict, very strong moral code, quite rightly. But this little girl, year 5, ran up to Mrs. Smith and she said, Mrs. Smith, before I can start my day, I just need to tell you something that I've done really bad. So Karen said, what's that, Evie? And she said, I've done something really bad, but I can't tell my mummy and daddy, so can I tell you? So Karen obviously said, yes, of course, you can tell me. She said, I might have accidentally stolen a packet of sweets. So Karen looked a little bit perturbed, had the conversation. It wasn't from a shop. It was, she'd found them lying on the floor in the swimming pool. So there was this conversation going backwards and forwards, and Evie was very sorry and very repentant and all of that. And then she said, but Mrs. Smith, can I tell you the really, really bad thing? So Karen said, of course you can tell me the really, really bad thing. She said, I ate them. So Karen kind of resolved that with her. But then Evie said, do you know what? I feel so much better for having told you. I can now go and start my day. So that's just a very anecdotal example of how Karen can kind of support the children and looks out for them. There was always something, apart from the wonderful Karen, there was always something that I felt was a little bit missing at Epping Upland. And the little bit missing came to evolve to be true about 3 years ago. Now, I don't do technology. Technology is my massive stress. So I'm afraid I'm going to show you a picture of what was missing. So what was missing was a school dog. So about 3 years ago, in an accidental, little bit like Kate said, accidental well-being, we accidentally acquired a dog, a school dog. The dog is called Bracken. She's a fox red Labrador, and she has transformed well-being within our school for children, for parents, and for staff. We've managed to train her now to walk to heel, so she's not on a lead in school, which is amazing. But one of the things that is absolutely fascinating is how she can change a child's attitude to learning, how the children will talk to the dog about what's worrying them, how children who are reluctant readers will read to the dog, how we can get reluctant children who don't want to come into school if Bracken comes in with them. So she has totally kind of added that last little bit to what we were missing. And at lunchtimes you'll find staff sitting with her in the staff room, just very gently stroking her. And a little bit like I said, you know, people don't really miss me if I'm out of the building, but they miss Karen. They miss the dog when the dog's out of the building. And currently Bracken is technically on maternity leave. She has a contract, so that entitles her to a maternity leave. And we are really missing her presence, but very, very excited about the fact that hopefully in another few months we might not just have a Bracken, but we might have a Bracken baby to kind of help support some of the work we do around wellbeing. But some of our children, when they're worried about their learning, if the dog just sits with them, then you can see that they just become calmer. So she has been absolutely remarkable. And again, there's a fairly amusing story about the dog with my CEO of the trust. He does a half-termly visit, and he'd never really kind of shown any particular interest in the dog, but obviously knew he had her. And but on one of his visits the last time, Bracken, to say, normally walks to heel and is very beautifully behaved. And Peter was walking down the corridor with his cup of coffee to on my way from the office, and I could hear the dog coming from behind me. But she wasn't walking on this occasion. She was literally charging down the corridor. And I was thinking, oh my goodness me, this is just going to go so horribly wrong and be not a very good advocate for having a school dog. And I just, oh my goodness me, I was so lucky. He said, Bracken. And she stood to heel, sat down. I thought, oh my goodness me, thank you for doing that just in front of the CEO. So now I don't have to persuade him why we actually have a school dog. So Epping Upland is a massive kind of focus for us on wellbeing, and that has evolved into the trust of 16 schools, as like I said. And I think that has kind of come from the relentless going on at people about how important it is, and how important it is not just to value our children, but we need to value our parents and our workforce. And so but whilst I'm going to talk a little bit about the trust, I think the same principles apply very much to individual schools and how we run our individual schools. One of the things that we established very early on was that we felt that while children's well-being is at the kind of heart of everything we believe in and we work towards, we need to make sure our staff are as well looked after, because if we have happy staff, we know that we get so much more from them, and that goodwill and we manage to retain them, that the environments become happier places because they're happy. And so one of the things we started was a workforce wellbeing group, and a group of schools looked into a pilot scheme where we all made a contribution towards called the Cherry Tree Pilot, and that was some work that we did with a professional counselling place in Buckhurst Hill. And what that has meant, that the 6 schools that have been looking at the pilot, any member of staff has been able to access free counselling through the Cherry Tree. And initially we were a little bit anxious as to how people would feel about that, and whether it would be a service that was used, but it has been exceptionally well used. But we found that the biggest success has been in the individual counselling. We have tried some group workshops and things, but they haven't worked quite so well, but that obviously is part of the pilot. The trust is evolving a wellbeing service, and one of the things that we are developing within that is trying to provide a range of support for staff to be able to access. So we, as a trust, we employ therapists and counsellors for our children, and we employ a family support worker to support our families and our parents. But there was nothing along those lines for the staff apart from the schools that were in the pilot. So this year we are looking at evolving support for the family support worker to staff, and already she's had some people get in touch with her to help them with things that she would obviously is able to provide, and making an offer that everybody feels they have something that they would go to that they're comfortable with. So that has been quite some development. We have also run a nurture programme for our parents, which is managed by our family support worker. So it's been very much looking at staff more recently, and a little bit like Kate was saying, we look towards the head teacher wellbeing, because we noticed, particularly in the past 18 months, that was something that head teachers were really struggling with. And we now have had introduced each term a wellbeing day for head teachers. And part of our performance management, we are not asked to say what we have done with our wellbeing day. We just have to say that we have used it, and that the trustees want to make governing bodies to make sure their heads are actually taking their wellbeing day. And that kind of followed a conversation with colleagues saying, when do we do our best thinking? When are we at our best? And one of my fellow head teachers said, I have my best inspiration when I'm driving my mower around my garden. He said, that's when I come up with all my best ideas. And I know for me, all my kind of best ideas or my best grounding and my best philosophy comes when I'm walking in the forest. And this was something that we were really wanting to advocate as something grounding, a step away from school to just help us reflect on our days. It's a little bit like, I understand Google, they have their reset days where their staff have to step away and just kind of ground themselves. But then we thought, if wellbeing days are being allocated to our head teachers, what about our workforce? So possibly controversially, but again, I think where we do things like this, we don't have to think of them as controversial, but more as celebratory. We added an additional inset day for all our staff. And so within the calendar year, every single member of staff, this one is decided by the school, has a day that is set aside that's not for them to come into school, it's for them to do exactly what they will with. And something that is relatively small, as to just adding on a day to a long weekend or something like that, the value that has made staff feel that they are important and that their well-being is important to the trust has really been quite interesting in the reception that received. So I think really what I'm trying to say is, as a trust, we're trying to make sure that we evolve. We always have thought about the children, but just as important to look after are our staff, because if they feel at their best, if their well-being is good, if their mental health is they're feeling well supported in that, then the workspace, the environment just becomes a better learning space for the children as well. But we don't want to forget the parents, because how the families are feeling obviously has the impact on the children as well. I think what would I want take homes to be from today is, from my training as leading a mentally healthy school, it's saying that it has to come from the top, that head teachers and leaders, trustees, it has to be modelled from the top, because it's not something that can be tokenistic, that you have to action it. You can't just talk the talk, you have to action it. And I think one of the successes that I have felt about the trust recently is, I had a very difficult decision to make at the beginning of term. I've been teaching for over head teacher for 24 years, and I have never ever missed the start of an academic year. But unfortunately, in the second week of the summer holiday, I tested positive in spite of being double jabbed, and was actually really quite unwell and was not well enough to come back to school. But my conscience of, oh my goodness me, I have to be back in school was overwhelming. But then I actually did cry when I made the decision that I was not well enough to come back. And I felt really guilty, I felt really uncomfortable, I felt I was landing my team in it. But my CEO took me to one side and said, Sarah, you are not well enough to be in school. I give you permission, if that's what you're feeling you need, I give you permission to make sure you make yourself well and come back when you're ready. And the school didn't fall apart. The parents were amazing, the staff were amazing, so they didn't need me, but for my well-being I did need to step away. But the beauty of that example, I think, was that it absolutely showed that well-being was coming from the very top of the tree within our trust. And I feel that's something I feel really proud of, that in a very kind of relatively short space of time that we've achieved. Sometimes people say about the cost of it, and you know, if there's not a financial cost, there's a time cost. And I think my answer to that, and my answer to the you know, when we first employed Karen all those years ago, was, is it something we cannot afford to do? Can we not afford to make sure we do everything within our power to look after our school communities so that we get the very, very best from them? And I'd like to kind of just close off with something else, another quote. You'll obviously realise I quite like quotes. I read this the other day and I thought this is the perfect example of why we do need to make sure we are looking after everybody, but most particularly our staff and our workforce. It's a quote by Henry Brooke Adams that says, "Teachers affect eternity. No one can tell where their influence stops." And that is how I would like to conclude.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We have had a question which is asking whether Bracken is a staff member's dog. You're still on mute at the moment, sorry.
That was the accidental conversation. One day I was sat in the staff room and I was saying, I am actually not a dog person, believe it or not, but I had read a lot of and heard a lot about therapy dogs, and happened to say I would love a school dog. And I thought I'd been saying this for quite some time. And then one of my TAs, who actually is a farmer's wife, she was very perplexed by this because she knows I don't really like dogs, but we started a conversation. And the next day she came back to me and she said, Simon says he will be the school dog owner. So yes, the school dog doesn't, Bracken doesn't belong to me, but she does belong to one of our members of staff. Yeah, so she's very, very much a part of the family. She sits on the gate in the morning, and sometimes it's the parents that go and talk to the dog rather than the children. She's on the gate at the end, and it's always having a fuss made of her. So yes, she's rather special. She is very, very special. And it's really interesting as well, the children, she responds differently to different children. So some of our high needs children, the way she behaves with them is very different to some of our other children. She kind of senses how she needs to be when she's with different people.
Thank you, that's really helpful, and we're getting some positive feedback in the chat, lots of food for thought and some ideas for people to seriously think about. So I think both of those case studies so far have hopefully generated some discussion points. We're going to give you now, I would say, about 10 minutes in a breakout room. So you'll be put into breakout rooms, and then following that, we will have our break for lunch. The afternoon session resumes at 1:10. So if you take about 10 minutes, that'll take you to 12:40. Make sure you get that half an hour break and be back for 1:10, where we will be continuing with our third and fourth case study. Good afternoon and welcome back to the second part of our day. We're going to be continuing for a short while longer with our focus on well-being, and we have two further case studies that we're going to be sharing with you. So the first of those is going to be Máire O'Regan, who is Executive Head Teacher in one of our Academy trusts, the Life Education Trust. And Máire is Executive Head Teacher over 4 small rural primary schools. So Máire, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and hello to everyone. And if you've gone to the pub for lunch, that's a one-off. I haven't done that for a long, long time now. But I would like to speak to you about wellbeing and really what happened to our schools during COVID, and where it did give us a space to have a think about our wellbeing in even more detail. I am part of the Life Education Trust, and they take wellbeing of the staff very, very seriously. We are a group of 7 schools. One of the schools is a mental health school that specialises in helping young people who have got severe mental health and emotional wellbeing. And so wellbeing for all of the staff is always on our agenda. So on the next slide, I've just given you a little summary of what we're going to talk about. And I can flick on to the next slide, how we coped on the first lockdown. So on the next slide, basically, I would, if you just move to the next slide, that would be really good. Yeah, here we go. So in the first lockdown, when it was announced, probably like most people, you know, in England, we did not really know what was going to happen. And I did have this very strange feeling that it was something very unusual and something I didn't really fully understand. And the first thing I sort of felt about the country was closing down. People were allowed to work from home. Some people were furloughed, but you know, teachers had to continue to survive and be completely superheroes. Now, we were very lucky that a friend of mine who worked for Ford made all the teachers in my two schools at the time, made all of them visors, and so we were probably the first people to start wearing visors around school, and that gave us a little certain amount of security in our sort of nervousness about COVID. But to me, the most important thing was well-being of the staff. Our staff is our most important asset, and it takes up most of our budget, and they're very special people. And to me, I just decided straight away that COVID was going to give us definitely some form of a mental health challenge. And so we set up 24/7 counselling for staff, which was where the counsellor came to school and met everybody in real life, and then she was available by phone all day and all through the night. Some members of staff took advantage of that. I don't know who they are, it was completely confidential, I just paid the bill. But I thought that sort of supported staff during that strange time. And our senior staff at Life all have a life coach anyway. And yes, I'm on the next slide now. Mental health. Yeah, our senior staff all have a life coach anyway. We meet our coach every half term, and that's part of the offer given to head teachers in Life. So I wanted to sort of spread that to all of the teachers, that they felt there was someone they could go to in this strange time of confusion. And then on the next slide, we looked at working hours. So on that Sunday, I remember sitting down to work out how am I going to make it a little bit easier for staff to cope in a time when we didn't really fully understand what was happening around the country. And we went on to a 14-day on and a 14-day off timetable. So teachers taught in school for 14 days, and then they worked from home for 14 days. So they felt as if they had time to recover and get away from the school environment, etc., etc. And we cancelled all meetings on the very first week of lockdown when it was announced to say that we were going to start a lockdown on the Thursday. We cancelled all the meetings that week so that people could sort of prepare their families, either buy in food or sort of get home to their families early at 4 o'clock time and just see what they could do as a family unit to sort of prepare for the lockdown. So people sort of appreciated all meetings being cancelled that day. And as I said, Ford cars were really good. They went into lockdown themselves. They were on furlough, and so they made us visors and delivered them to the school, which was great. In school then, on a practical level, on a day-to-day basis, we put in an extra 15-minute break in the afternoon for all the teachers and staff, and basically because I wanted people to get daylight and I wanted them to get sunshine. So teachers brought their own class outside. They had a slot when they could go out there for 15 minutes if they wanted to. And it was just meant that they had an extra 15 minutes a day with their class, cup of tea, get some sunlight, and just have a little bit of downtime. Our school and both our schools, all of our schools, obviously were cleaned very, very carefully, and they were cleaned all through the middle of the day. So we had a cleaning staff who came in just after lunch at about 1 o'clock, and all the schools were cleaned, so they were being cleaned in the middle of the day as well. And then we had fun things to do, like we had a raffle on a Friday afternoon. All the staff threw their names into the hat, and we picked out one. We sat around together, pulled out a ticket, and somebody got a prize. Some of those prizes were donated by senior staff or Life. And Life were really good. They started to put in lots of things for us for our well-being, and they actually gave us money to pay for fresh fruit or things that they thought would be uplifting for the staff. So we did actually buy oranges every single day. The staff were always eating oranges, and Life then gave us enough money for us to have an afternoon tea. When I thought about, thank you, healthy eating, when I thought about the staff and the beginning of lockdown, I tried to put myself in a position of, you know, a mum with a young child, trying to be a teacher, trying to run the family home, or a dad who's teaching and trying to run the family home. And I think the hardest thing for us was working all day, meetings after school, and then to go to Tesco's and you couldn't buy anything. So we got a member of staff to go out to Morrison's, which was the closest shop to Roxwell, and put together a survival box for every single member of staff, LSAs, cleaners, everyone. Everybody got a survival box, and that included enough food and toilet roll and bleach for a whole week. So it alleviated a little bit of pressure. Morrison's then realised what we were doing, and we started to get staff discount from Morrison's, which we were very grateful for. And then staff then ate for free every day. So all our food is home cooked on the premises in Roxwell, which is very lovely. We have a brilliant cook, she's fantastic. And the staff started to eat with all the children, home cooked food. And that was really nice. It meant people didn't have the stress of preparing lunches. And then as we went on to the winter, I'm going on to the next slide now, managing home life. Again, it was all the time thinking about what could give you stress as a teacher in a situation where the shops are not open. Definitely for me, if my son had been a young age, he's older now, it would have been Santa would have been my big stress. And our school became an Amazon drop-off, and my office became Santa hide away all the presents and store them, because in the past, of course, you could go to grandma, granddad and put stuff in the attic, and all these small things create, you know, stress in people's lives. So Amazon was our regular go-to. And then staff started to walk a little bit more in the afternoon. In Roxwell, our field is 9 minutes away from the school, and our school field in Margaretting is about 4 minutes away. So we do have to do a walk to get to our fields, and staff started to walk with the children at lunch times rather than have their lunch hour. And they were trying to do 5,000 steps every day, which was really good. I think the staff were feeling positive about their well-being. They were eating good food, fruit in the afternoon, and 15 minutes sunshine, and then walking at lunchtime. And then a bit like Sarah, who spoke before lunch, we've always had, well, I've called it a gift day, but my CEO likes work-life balance day, but you know, it's a day off. So what we do is we actually give a day to every member of staff, all of the staff, get a day of their choice. So like a birthday or a celebration or wedding anniversary or a shopping day before Christmas. And everybody gets that day off every year. And the staff, we've been doing this for 5 years now. The staff just put in the day in as advance as possible to help us to not have to pay too much money on cover. And they put their day in birthdays or anniversaries or holidays, tag it on to a half term so they get a cheaper flight. And we've been doing that for 5 years, and I know staff really like it. And then our next one, we're on to the next slide. So then we did find a horse on the A127. I didn't buy him, and his name is Paddy, because he's my horse, and I'm Irish. And we saw him abandoned on the A127, and he was blind in one eye, and he had cancer, and he was like really hungry. And our LSA adopted him. She has another horse, and we brought him to our field outside the school, the other side of the school. And when I say a horse, I don't mean a little cute little pony. He's like a massive, big gypsy cob. So he's black and white gypsy cob, about 17 hands. He's huge. And so he sort of recovered during lockdown 1. We took care of him. He comes into the playground. We brush his mane. We plait his hair in our school colours. He's got a coat in our school colours with our school logo on it. And he started to get better being with the children. And the children just love him. And especially during lockdown, he was our big treat every week. Paddy would come in. He's now been trained to listen to readers. I mean, obviously, he's got no phonic knowledge, but you think he would, because the children are completely convinced that he knows all about reading. So he reads about every fortnight in the playground. The children all line up and they read and give him a treat. And so the lady who rescued him wrote an article for the Horse and Hound, which was published a few months ago. And of course, the article is all about Paddy got better because he loved coming to school and meeting the children. But I would sort of say the children have gained so much from Paddy. And he's adorable. We love him now. We've got a child who's suffered from bereavement on the very last day of term in July, lost her mum, and Paddy's amazing. She goes over to him for 15 minutes in the morning and says hello, gives him an apple and has a little chat with him, and she's set up for the day. So the One Show want us to cover that story, and we're working on that. And if you can see a little tiny typo there, do apologise. Yes, so Paddy has been really great. And then we had a student social worker who did a 6-month analysis about how he was having an impact on the children and feedback on that, and that was really good. We, of course, during COVID couldn't do the proper nativity in the school hall, so we went to a local farm and asked them for a loan of their barn, and we brought all the children to the barn, and Paddy played a really important part in the nativity story. And we also found out in the village of Roxwell there's a little sheep who walks around the village on a lead, and he's got a little bit of special needs. Oh, no, it's a girl, and her name is Gwen. And I stopped her owner and said, you know, why is your sheep on a lead? And they said Gwen doesn't like grass, she eats pellets, and she's a little bit special needs. So she was in the nativity as well. Gwen came along, the mayor came along, and we had this fabulous nativity outdoors with Paddy and Gwen, the special needs sheep, and in a beautiful barn. So we've made the best creatively of sort of being in a situation that was sort of stressful. I would say my next slide is well-being in the community. That's it. And so Paddy has been sort of a really important part in our school and embedding itself in our local community. Roxwell has had a little bit of an interesting Ofsted, I'll just leave it like that. And so we sort of had a lot of work to do to build up our good reputation, our status really in our community. And Paddy's really helped us with that, and the children have been fabulous. And really, in some ways, COVID has also sort of taught us how important community is. So, you know, you're trying to build up a community in your local village, but you can't actually talk to anybody or invite them into school. But, you know, we just found ways of doing lovely things. So we delivered chocolate on Valentine's Day, and we'd leave it on the doorstep and knock on the door and wave and blow kisses to people. And we delivered things at Easter. And then for Palm Sunday, one of the children is able to ride Paddy. She gets lessons. Paddy and the little girl and all the school followed us down to church for Palm Sunday with all our palms on top of Paddy. And we've just done lovely things around the village during COVID, because the whole thing about well-being and sometimes is giving to other people. So we planted bulbs secretly around the village, and of course in spring they all came out and the whole village was full of colour. And then we sort of did a few tweets to say actually it was us, it's a gift from the school. And so that is very good for well-being for the children as well as the staff. What is the future for Wellbeing? Well, some things that we thought about creatively during COVID are things that we've decided to keep in our schools. We're going to permanently adopt Paddy, and he had an adoption party, and he's got a birth cert and an adoption certificate hanging up on the wall in school, and he's definitely one of us now. We've sanitised our hands, continue to do that 6 times a day, and actually our attendance has gone up. And the PPE equipment, I think, is really important. That is always, you know, there for staff to feel as if we're supporting them. So I never have a problem if somebody wants to wear any form of PPE equipment during school, because if that makes them feel as if we care about them and we are registering that they're a little bit anxious or worried, and we want to support them. And as I've said, we love Paddy, we're never going to get rid of him. So the future, and the next slide, please. So counselling now is in place daily for all staff. So our trust took on our idea of having 24/7 counselling for the staff, because it worked so well in school when we did it as just a school. So Life now have offered us 24/7 counselling for every member of the Life Trust, which I think is brilliant. Coaching continues for all the SLT now. We have sort of a variety of coaches that we work with to help people at different tiers and different levels in their professional career. And the coaches are very challenging, and, you know, I find it extremely useful. And so Life support that and pay for that. We've continued with our afternoon breaks. Not everybody takes an afternoon break, but if it falls naturally into your curriculum, the teachers just love that chance to take the children out for, you know, 10 minutes, especially if the weather is really good. And the work-life balance day, which is your day off, continues because I actually wrote an article for the TES in December about it and about the success rate of it. And I just think teachers, you know, don't get an awful lot of bonuses. I know people will think we've got amazing holidays, but let's be honest, we all work quite hard, and that's been a really special treat, really, in our trust and in our schools. And the community projects will always continue, because I'll be honest, they brought so much joy to the children, and we got so much amazing feedback from our immediate community. But we also have a school that we've got in Kenya that we are in contact with, and we've got an international award for all the work we've done with them. But we're trying to, you know, extend our immediate community. I was talking to Heather in a breakout room by following the story of Amal, the 20-foot puppet who is representing refugees. She's a 20-foot puppet walking from Syria to London, arrives in London on the 24th of October. And the 4 rural primaries that I'm executive head of are following her story. We're going to meet her in London in October. But she's been a fantastic symbol, really, of what children need to know about the wider world, about that actually not everybody has got a home and not everybody lives in a place that is safe. And that's been a really big success story. That's if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see the links. And Amal has met the Pope a few weeks ago. She's been to Glastonbury at the start of her journey, and she's coming to the Globe Theatre and St. Paul's Cathedral on the 24th of October. So we'll meet her there and finish off our study of her walk from Syria to London. So Wellbeing has been quite a complex and wide experience for us. And you know, if you were to look at COVID, what did it do to our schools? It gave us space to say what is really, really important, which is actually the people around us, family, friends. And family is not necessarily your relatives, but it's your school family, your community family. And we've learned a lot. There was a lot of time to think. And I would think most of the SLT now in my 4 rural primary schools journal, and that comes from our coaching. And we do journal to look at our own emotions and to get to know ourselves really, really well. And I think when you know yourself really well, you actually become a better leader. So no, we don't have a school dog, Sarah. I'm a bit jealous, but we do have a school horse. And so that's it. Any questions, anyone? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Máire. It's really wonderful to hear from 2 case studies about the power that animals are having with the pupils and staff in the school, but also to start thinking about that wider community impact and actually how that can bring wellbeing benefits to pupils and staff too. So thank you very, very much. Our 4th and final case study in this part of the day is from Naureen, who is Deputy Head Teacher at George Carey Primary School. So I'm going to hand over to Naureen.
Thank you, Carrie. Just okay, so I've got my screen, brilliant. Now, hello everyone. I am going to continue with the COVID theme and staff wellbeing, and I'm going to start off with my COVID journey, the idea behind setting up a COVID care group, the impact of it, that it had, and also the future involvement of the COVID care group. So this was November 2020. Does sound like I'm going to tell you a story, but it will be very brief and it will provide some context. So in November 2020, my youngest son came home unwell, and the next day my husband was feeling sick as well. The 4 of us then went to get a PCR test, and my husband and my youngest son were tested positive, and my eldest and I were both negative. We were happy that we were negative, but little did we know they had already shared the virus with us, and 7 days later we both were tested positive as well. During that time, this was, I think, the 2nd wave of COVID, and there was very little known. So I assumed that, 10 days and I would be better. But that was not the case. And I found myself to getting to day 23, day 25, and I was still not well. I was still not feeling my pre-COVID self. Then I decided to do some research, and when I looked, there was very little research about long COVID, which is what I had. There was also a lack of information from medical professionals, so I decided to look into things, and I also decided to look into research from other countries. I found myself looking at exercises to help with muscles and joints, exercises to check your lung capacity, blood tests, looking into x-rays, looking into anti-inflammatory diets. I'm not a professional, I'm not a medical professional at all, but I just needed to find out why it was taking so long for me to recover. At the end of January and February, I went back to work. I had a phased return to work, and I had conversations with my head teacher and our HR lead as well, and just telling them that I wasn't ready to do a full day at school. Whilst I was at school, there were other staff members who had family members who were unwell, or they themselves had COVID as well. I found myself talking to them, listening to them, and also we were sharing advice with each other. And then one of them, because I was talking about diets and exercises, and then one staff member said, why don't we set up a group where we can share all our ideas and strategies? And that's what happened. And then we formed a COVID care group. The COVID care group was open to everybody, and we did have staff who hadn't had COVID that attended. We had a few senior leaders who came, and it was really good having our HR and our business manager there as well. We had representatives from all teams across the school, middays, teaching assistants, teachers, cleaners, and it really did provide everybody a platform to just share their experience, to discuss strategies, and also just to have a confidential conversation. I had never set up a support group before, and so I really had to think about the purpose of the group, just how often we would meet, who hosted the group. I didn't want it to be me all the time. how was the agenda decided, and I was also very aware of my role in the school as well, and the the influence and the questions that I sometimes have to ask staff, and where did it happen. And because at that time we were in wave 2, the COVID care group meetings, they happened remotely. We also looked at timings, when was the most appropriate time to have the meeting, and then we went on to set up a WhatsApp group, and on the WhatsApp group the agenda was decided, and we did have other people that wanted to host the meetings, and we decided on how often we would do them. So the impact that the group had on staff was members felt supported from SLT and HR. The group provided a safe platform to share their experiences, and one member of staff said it feels like free therapy and really appreciate it. We had a mind and body coach who also attended the group, and so she shared strategies about exercise and diet and just helping with people's anxiety, because not only were staff affected with the long COVID, but they were also anxious about coming back to school and being in crowds of people again, and they had to be phased in through risk assessments. Through the group, members motivated each other, and we had a few members of staff who then decided to go for a walk at lunchtime, just to build up their lung capacity and to build up their energy levels, and they motivated each other through that. We did have a very phased return approach through risk assessments, and very anxious staff were asked to just come in initially for a visit, and then they built up to coming in for an hour or 2 hours and then half a day, and they felt very supported through that as well. Moving on. Again, so through the phased return, we looked at duties of staff members as well. So incorporating rest times and making sure that they had lighter duties. Members also shared strategies. So we have one teacher who enjoyed journaling, and she would share that with the staff. We talked about meditation, we talked about exercises, and also during the COVID care group meetings, we would start off with a 10-minute exercise at the beginning of the meeting. So I think the mind and body coach really supported the group with her strategies. And we talked about COVID behavioural therapy and nutrition, and she completely understood because she had COVID herself, and her recovery did take a long time as well. Also, another strategy we used during the meetings was a scaling technique, and we just said, how are you feeling today from 0 to 10? And then we talked about what do you need to get to, if you're a 7 and do you want to get to 8, what would you need to do, just to kind of measure progress, measure physical and mental progress as well. So the WhatsApp group was initially created to kind of set the agenda and talk about timings, but then it evolved into people sharing, programs and panorama programs or any other programs that were related to long COVID. We would share videos on there, we would share motivational quotes, and if somebody had gone for a walk and managed to go for like a half an hour walk during the weekend, they would put that on there, or try this or try that. So that was very effective. To kind of gain more positiveness in the group, we shared little wins for the week, just to share small achievements that people felt they had done. And I think it was looking at those small progresses, and sometimes people had really terrible days and they were just like, no, I had a really terrible day, but it was okay, you got through half your day, or you got through the full day, or you achieved this, so it was just looking at those small little wins. And I would say the future for the COVID care group is that it's now evolved into a wellbeing group. And the sessions so far have been remote, but I'm planning to do some face-to-face sessions. And again, it's thinking about the challenges are the timing of it is, you know, sometimes staff are busy with childcare in the mornings or after school. So we're going to have some protective time for it. And we want to keep all those good things that we had in the initial group, which were motivating, which were strategies. We still like to have the life and the mind and body coach there. I think that was a very good investment to have that in the group. She was brilliant, and people have talked about maybe having yoga classes after school. Yes, so it's going to continue to evolve, and I hope our COVID peer group has given all of you some ideas to share with your staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that overview of your COVID-19 care group. I think it's really interesting how we've listened today to how things that have emerged during what was quite a crisis period in COVID are now looking at how they can be embedded into the practice moving forward. And I think there's some really positive lessons that we can all take from that. So thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed those 4 case studies. We knew that they were very diverse and people had approached things from very different directions. And hopefully that's given you all some food for thought as to how you could perhaps take some of those things and apply them in your own schools, within your trusts, or within your local consortium groups. It brings us to the end of verse 2, Schools of Wellbeing, and we'll shortly be moving into verse 3, which is Schools of Environmental Justice. But before we do that, we did want to give you a quick screen break because when we come back, we'll be having our keynote presentation. So a bit of time away from the screen for 5 minutes or so, I think would be really useful. So if we say, let's say come back at 1:50, ready for verse 3 and our keynote speaker. So we'll see you all at 1:50. Hello and welcome back to verse 3, which is the part of the day which is all about schools of environmental justice. And to introduce us to that part of our session, I'm going to welcome Peter Palmer, the Buildings Officer for the Diocese of Chelmsford Education Team. Over to you, Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for giving me a short period of time with you. I haven't met all of you. I've met a few of you since I've been in this role. My role here since January has been looking after the buildings, the land, and as part of that, the environmental issues and challenges that we have. As you're all aware, we have quite a mixture of properties. Most, I would say, challenging in the fact that they're either historic, some would say prehistoric, and a good mixture of good old 60s and 70s buildings. So we have started on a number of projects within the diocese for environmental and decarbonisation, and we are starting to forge some partnerships with some partners to carry those on. We've had some good news stories. We've put solar PV and air heat source pumps into St Peter's School in Southfield in Brentwood, together with a good number of schools have changed from standard light and electricity over to LED. So we've started the projects. There's a lot more to do, and with such a different mix of properties, we are at a stage where we will be certainly the voluntary aided schools looking to see what we can do as a collective with regard to, some will say, the low-hanging fruit with regard to energy bills and indeed green energy. And by using those partnerships and those relationships with those companies that we're starting to work with, then increasing the footprint of what we can do with the ancillary products away from predominantly gas and oil. A lot of the schools that we have, unfortunately, because their location, still run on oil, which is not particularly clean and clear for everybody. And a lot of the schools we have, as you're probably aware, have outdated gas boilers. So that's going to be certainly in the forefront of what we do, and then we can bring in the secondary and more cost-effective solutions later on to solar. The biggest challenge we have is financing, and we have been very successful with some SALEX grants. Those have currently stopped at present, and we're now looking for other avenues to get grants or funding to roll out our projects and the decarbonisation to hit the projects set by both the Church of England and obviously the government over the coming years. So that's a brief introduction, and I think without further ado, I will hand you over to Ruth, who is going to speak in a lot more detail than I can on this subject.
Thank you. Well, hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's really wonderful to be able to join with you. As always, I have to start by apologising that we're not, or not apologising, but saying how sad I am that we're not able to meet in person. I know if we were, then we would be meeting each other, chatting over coffee. There would be much more dynamics. So I'm sorry that I just come in and then go out in this way that happens online. But it does mean that I get to stay at my kitchen table where I have sat pretty much for the last, what are we getting on for 20 months? I don't know. I know for you it's different, but I've been working from home for all of that time and just beginning to get back into the office, still doing most of my speaking engagements online. But I'm looking forward to a few that are in person, just beginning over the next few months towards the end of the year. But it's really good to be able to join with you in this way anyway. And just to introduce myself a bit, I don't know how much you know of who I am, but I'm talking to you from my kitchen table down in the south of England, in Chichester, where I live on a council, or what was a council estate, a social housing estate, where I moved on to. We've lived here as a family for 25, 26 years, very much wanting to outwork things from my Christian faith, really, of thinking around how can I be responding to a God of justice and living in ways locally, as well as thinking about that from a global perspective. So for many years was involved in starting up and chairing a local community association, and have been doing a lot on the local estate here, just in a voluntary capacity, and with 7 doors down, the local primary school that both of my girls have been through. In my day job, I work for a Christian organisation called Tear Fund, which is an aid and development and advocacy organisation. We work in around 50 countries, 50 of the poorest countries in the world, really coming alongside people and working to see people lifted out of poverty. And we do that very much through working through the local church, so working through local churches and church networks and denominations and church organisations. So we will never go in as an organisation and build a school or give out mosquito nets or whatever it might be. We always work alongside the local church and help them, equip them to respond to the poverty needs that are among them, that are in their church and in their local community, and also from an advocacy perspective, speaking out to the authorities locally and nationally to bring about change for them. And that means that the work that we do is really sustainable, because where you have organisations that just go in, build something that isn't really owned by the local community, then when that organisation leaves, then it falls apart. Whereas the local church and other faith organisations, they're there for the long haul, and they will always be there. So if something is rooted in the local church or the church denomination, then it's much more likely to be sustainable and to be longer lasting. So we work on a whole range of different issues. We work in some of the most fragile and conflicted states, your Yemens and South Sudan and Syria and the different countries that you would hear about on the news. We're currently finding ways to respond into Afghanistan. And we work a lot around environmental and economic sustainability as well. So we have a whole range of different things that we do. And I'm one of the directors there. I head up a group that's slightly strangely called the Global Advocacy and Influencing Group. And this has a range of different teams in it, but it's got a big focus on our advocacy work. So that's not only advocacy within the UK, but it's also working to support and increase the advocacy with our partners, with the communities that we serve, and speaking to governments and global institutions around the issues that create poverty and that keep people poor. At the moment, as you would expect, we have a heavy emphasis on the climate crisis and have done so, and will continue to do so for a long time. So I oversee all of the advocacy work that we do as Tear Fund, and also oversee our theology work. And there's a remarkable amount of theology that happens within Tear Fund, because if we're going to work alongside the local church, then there's a work to do very often in helping churches to understand their role in responding to the poverty needs that are among them. Often the churches that we serve come with a theology that says they are just there to preach the gospel and plant churches. And we work with them, helping them understand that part of the Christian calling is responding to people's physical needs as well, and also taking care of the land that people live on. So part of the work that we do is helping change people's minds and hearts in order then to be able to equip them to take practical action. And again, as with our whole way of working, that ensures that the work that we do is much more sustainable, because it's really rooted in people's faiths and in people's worldviews. So that's just a little snapshot of who I am and Tear Fund, who I work with. But we're here today, or this afternoon in this session, to be thinking about our responsibility to the environment and what that might look like for us in our schools, how we can be practicing environmental justice, some tips and some foundational thinking for why this is important for us. And this is an important topic for us for a couple of things that I want to highlight as to why this is urgent now. Firstly, because of the pandemic. The pandemic might seem unrelated to our climate crisis and to the environmental crisis, but actually COVID-19 is first and foremost an environmental disaster. And it's to our peril if we forget that. So COVID-19, we are pretty sure, 99% sure, has come about because of the transference of this zoonotic disease from creatures that existed in the wild, and then because of things like deforestation and the wet markets, the illegal trade in animals, and a whole host of different things that we are doing badly. Because of that, that allowed the virus to jump species and to find a new host species to come onto us. And because of our addiction to flying, it quickly spread around the world and became a global disaster and a global pandemic. But the COVID-19 really illustrates our absolutely broken relationship with the wider natural world. And it shows that when we have a broken relationship with nature, it does impact us. When we have an environmental disaster like COVID-19, it very quickly becomes a social disaster and an economic disaster. And the pandemic has shown us that you can't separate out environment, from society, from economics. All of these things are intricately and integrally linked. So the pandemic really should be a wake-up call to us. If we don't protect the wider natural world, we will see more pandemics like we've been experiencing, and we may see them with viruses that ultimately are far more deadly than COVID-19 has been. And of course, in other countries, many of the countries that we're working in as Tear Fund, we're seeing COVID-19 having a different impact than it has here after the initial shock. And of course, we're working hard in the area of vaccines and are really seeing the terrible impact that COVID-19 is having. But this isn't a surprise. Scientists were warning for years that if we didn't act well towards nature, then we would see outbreaks of viruses such as COVID-19. So the pandemic should be a wake-up call to us to be acting well and restoring our broken relationship with the wider natural world. And it gives us an opportunity, or it should have given us an opportunity, to use the economic recovery to put us onto a different track, one that takes us away from our polluting ways and from fossil fuels and puts us on track towards a greener future. So the pandemic was a lesson. It should have been a wake-up call. It should have been the opportunity to change track. Sadly, I don't think it has been any of those things, but it is urgent. The issues we're looking at today are urgent because of what the pandemic has taught us. And then secondly, it's urgent because, of course, in 1 month's time today, we have the COP26 talks, the UN climate talks. And I expect I hardly need to rehearse with you just how much of a serious situation we are in as a species. The beginning of August, the IPCC brought out their seminal report, their sixth one, I think it was, their sixth report, which just reinforced, in one sense, there wasn't anything new in that, but it reinforced that the climate crisis is real and that we have to act urgently. I've been speaking about climate for something like 25 to 30 years. And for many of those years, building on the work of scientists who I knew and respected, I was talking in the language of predictions. This is what is going to happen in the future if we don't change our ways. We must act now, otherwise this is going to happen. And it's been awful for me over the last few years to come to the realization that we're not in the land of predictions anymore. We're in the land of reality. So we are now in a climate crisis. We are in a climate emergency. If we just think of the last few months with wildfires and droughts and floods and heat waves, so many things, the hurricanes in Haiti, so many things all coming together at once. This is a climate emergency. There are no other reasons for this. So we have COP26 that we are headed towards. And this is an issue of real importance to our young people. You may know that the Youth COP has been happening in Milan, which has given an opportunity for young people to have their voice. The climate crisis is something that young people are really struggling with and are needing us to respond on. Just from a church perspective, at Tear Fund, earlier this year, we brought out, actually last year, we brought out a report called Burning Down the House, in which we surveyed young Christians from the UK. We asked 14 to 19-year-olds about their thoughts on the climate, the church, and their faith. Our survey showed that 9 out of 10 young people are concerned about the climate crisis, but only 1 in 10 thinks that their church is doing enough about it. and 8 out of 10 thinks that Christians should respond to climate change. Only 1 in 10 of the 14 to 19-year-olds who we surveyed thinks that their church is doing enough about it. So from a church perspective, there is a big gap between what our young people think and what we are doing as churches, and maybe that transfers similarly into our church schools. So as we look at the pandemic, as we look at COP26, we know that the issues that we are talking about this afternoon are absolutely relevant and absolutely urgent now. But let me reinforce that by giving you 4 reasons why we need to act now. These are 4 simple reasons that we can communicate to our churches and to our schools. 4 very straightforward reasons. Firstly, for the sake of the earth. Just touched on that a little bit, but the wider environment is facing a crisis. Our human activities are fundamentally altering the whole creation. There was a major intergovernmental report, I think it was 2 years ago now, which found that 66% of marine environments and 75% of land environments have been changed because of us. And that is having terrifying and terrible consequences as ecosystems are collapsing and species are going extinct. There was a study in the Lancet magazine, just last week, I think it was, that talked about a report, no, sorry, not the Lancet. Couple of weeks ago, sorry, let me get this right. Couple of weeks ago, there was a report from the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and they reported that 23 species have recently been declared extinct, including something called the Lord God woodpecker. 23 species just in the last very short little while have been declared extinct. The recent heat wave in Canada, they think, led to 1 billion marine creatures dying. Can you, I know we're sitting in a conference at our desks, can you just pause and take that in? 1 billion marine creatures died earlier this year because of the heat wave that was caused by our changing climate off the northwest coast of Canada. That's horrendous. We are seeing creatures dying and species going extinct at a terrifying rate, from the Komodo dragon, that exotic creature thousands of miles away that's threatened on the little island that it lives on, threatened by rising sea levels, to the puffin, the much loved creature and much loved bird much closer to home, that is on the extinction list because it relies on sand eels, and the rising temperatures in the seas mean that numbers of sand eels are diminishing. So our earth is suffering, our earth is struggling, and for the sake of the earth, we need to be responding. Secondly, for the sake of people living in poverty, at Tear Fund, we hear every day how the climate crisis is devastating the lives of people living in poverty. More frequent droughts and floods mean that crops are ruined, people are going hungry, the loss of homes and jobs is happening, children are missing out on education, millions of people are being forcibly displaced by weather-related hazards. I could give you the names of so many people in so many communities that we serve, or Bisa in northeast Ethiopia, who has to walk for 10 hours a day because the rains don't come anymore. Jessie in Malawi, who loses her crops regularly because of the lack of rain, and then when the rain does come, it comes too much and the river floods and her crops are ruined. Person after person after person I could tell you about who is suffering from the impact of the climate crisis. So for the sake of people living in poverty, we need to be responding. Thirdly, for our own sakes, because we are part of the natural world. And whilst predominantly at the moment we are seeing people living in poverty who are facing the impact, ultimately this is going to impact all of us. The pandemic has shown us that what happens in one country ultimately impacts everywhere. And as we've seen, floods, the floods in Germany and the heat wave in Canada, the wildfires in California and Australia, China facing the worst floods it's had in 1,000 years. None of us are going to be immune. This will impact all of us, if only through the economic shocks that will come as nation after nation faces devastation, and through the influx of refugees that we will face. So for the sake of not only people living in poverty, but also for our own sakes, and because we are connected with the wider natural world. Biblically, we are Adam. Adam is a play on words. It comes from the Hebrew for earth, for ground, which is the Adamah. So when in Genesis 1 we are created and called Adam, Adam to begin with isn't a name. Adam always has a the in front of us. It's always the Adam. We are earth creatures. We are earthy ones. We are totally connected with the wider natural world. We know that. We know scientifically that how much DNA we share with a cucumber and a slug, let alone with a chimpanzee or an orangutan. We come from the dust, and to the dust we shall return. We are created as earth creatures. And when the wider natural world is harmed, then we also are harmed. And we know that when we have a good connection with the wider natural world, then that impacts positively our health and our well-being. We saw it during the pandemic, didn't we? I know you will see it with your children, with your pupils. When they're able to get outside, they will behave better than when they're stuck indoors. I'm sure it's not only the children, the pupils who behave better when we've been able to get outside. For all of our sakes, we need to respond to the climate crisis and to our whole environmental crisis. And then fundamentally, for God's sake, and of course I'm speaking to you as leaders in church schools coming from a particular diocese, and so you carry that faith mandate with you into your church lives, into your school lives. And I would love you to help communicate to your pupils and to those around you the very simple truth that God has made this world and God loves it. This isn't something that God thinks is rubbish and is going to be destroyed. And so we're just here for a short while before we can be whisked off to heaven. The biblical faith is a very earthy, physical faith. Matter matters to God in the Bible. We're told that God looked at all that he had made and God said, it is fantastic. It's very good. This world is inherently precious to God. Colossians 1, 15 to 20, those amazing verses that some of you might be familiar with, tell us that this world, that all things on heaven and on earth were created by Jesus and in Jesus and for Jesus. This world exists in Jesus. And it's almost as if it was a present from the Father to the Son. It doesn't quite say that, but all things were created for Jesus, to give Jesus the glory. And so how then can we live in a way that destroys something that is so precious and so loved by the God who we worship and who we seek to bring into our schools and into our school lives? So let's help our pupils and our teachers to appreciate just how wonderfully beautiful and precious the created world is. Precious to God, terribly wounded, terribly, terribly wounded, but absolutely wonderful. And as human beings, we've been given a very special job. We've been given the task of representing God, of being God's ambassadors, of reflecting him, being his image bearers to the wider natural world. So we have been created, the sense of Genesis 1:26 to 28 is that we have been created to be the final species that is created to look after everything else. So this world is loved and precious to God, and we as his image bearers have a job to do. It's a task that is amazingly precious in itself. What sense of worth that gives us, that God has given us the job of looking after the rest of what he has made. This is who we are. We are here to be servants of the wider natural world. We know that it's gone wrong because of us, and the Bible makes no qualms about that. We see in various places through the scriptures that the wider world suffers degradation. It mourns, it revolts because of the sin of the people. So it has gone wrong because of us, but we have a place, a part to play in God's plans for reconciliation, for salvation, for redemption. And so we have a role to play in taking care of this world. So 4 simple reasons that we can communicate to those around us that we need to act for the sake of the earth, for the sake of people living in poverty, for our own sakes, and then fundamentally for the sake of the Lord God, the God of justice, who calls us to spend ourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, and the Lord of all creation, who loves this world and created it to be very good. So then, let's act. Let's take action. Let's take up our rightful place as image bearers, as people who are called to take care of other people, to act on behalf and with people living in poverty, and to take care of the wider natural world. And I want to encourage you to place environmental action at the heart of your work in your schools, asking yourselves, what sort of world do you want to build now and in the future? What has the pandemic highlighted to you that has been both good and bad? What have been the positives of lockdown that you would want to keep? Maybe that the driving less, hearing the bird song, not seeing the airplane trails in the sky, having more time with family and friends. The sense of community, how can we keep that and build on it? What choices can we make in our schools to build on that? What are the negatives that it highlighted to us as well? Our inherent selfishness, as well as our community mindedness. The ways that the bird song and the lack of cars on the road and the lifting of pollution, what that showed us about how damaging our lifestyles are. What can we learn from that we can take forward in our own lives and in our schools? What kind of world do we want to build now for ourselves, in our schools, in our churches, in our faith communities? I know not all of you here will be from churches. What kind of world do we want to build now and into the future? And what do we need to do to get there? Well, there are all sorts of practical things that we can do. And I know that many of you will be from schools that are already taking action. And after this, there'll be a time when you'll be getting into groups and you can share the different sorts of things that you can do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of the different ideas, because there are so many ways in which you can take action. knowing I was talking on this, I put something up on my social media feeds and said, are you from a school that's doing something? And I just got loads and loads of comments. One school that said they'd installed solar panels on the roof, replaced all their heating, all their lighting, sorry, with LED, and installed an air source heat pump. That, I know that sounds like big projects, but they also have a wildlife garden that not only encourages bees and butterflies, but it's self-sustaining. So all of the food and the garden waste is composted, which then enables the children to plant and to grow fruit and vegetables in allotment beds. And in case you're wondering, well, goodness, that sounds like a countryside school, we haven't got the space to do that. That actually was from an inner city school in Lambeth. My daughters, my youngest, sorry, has just left, but my daughter's secondary school recently had a Go Green week where they did all kinds of different things. They had one day where they focused on encouraging packed lunches that were meat-free and reduced their plastic, didn't have plastic as much as possible. They had one day where people could bring in old batteries and pens and old phones for recycling. They had one day that was a car-free day, and they had a cycle-powered karaoke. They had one day where everyone came in upcycling, fancy dress, and so on and so on. Lots and lots of different ideas that I could give you. Really, it's just down to our creativity and also how much time we're prepared to put in. And not all of it requires money, but it is often down to our creativity. So lots of things that we can be doing practically. But with that, I also want to highlight a second aspect, which is I think we also need to be helping our pupils to respond emotionally. And I think increasingly we're going to be finding that there are psychological impacts on our pupils as they face the climate crisis. And we will have a role in our schools to be responding to that. So I mentioned the Lancet earlier. I was getting confused with my different research papers. The Lancet last week released a report that was a global report, 45, that showed that 45%, so nearly half of young people globally feel climate anxiety and feel that climate anxiety negatively impacts their lives. And it's something that I'm certainly facing with my daughters. I have older daughters now, 18. One is packing while I talk. She's off to university tomorrow, 18 and 21. And they both, in their different ways, particularly the eldest, faces climate anxiety and just asks herself, what world is she growing up into? And how is she going to respond to that? So I would ask you, alongside the practical things that you do, also be finding ways to be responding to the emotional needs of your pupils and of your teachers. We all face this. And to be providing space and opportunities for pupils just to be talking about how they feel. So there's a lot of action, but I believe it's also important that there are times when we don't have action and we stop, and we have times to pause and to reflect. And increasingly, I'm seeing a need for lament. We might not want to call it lament in our schools, but lament, time to stop, to say sorry, to feel the pain of what our world and its people and other creatures are facing, to really face into the tragedy of what we have created and the tragedy of what we are going to be leaving our children, the tragedy of what our school children now are going to be growing up into. So helping our pupils to respond and deal mentally with the world that's in crisis is going to be something you are increasingly called to do. I just want to finish with a few tips And I know in your groups, you'll have many more that you can share with each other. But a few things that I've learned a little bit through schools. I was a bit involved with, when my girls were at primary school, with setting up an eco club for them many years ago. And also particularly through churches and the eco church scheme, which I was involved in starting up. And I think the things are very transferable. So firstly, we need a whole, and I'd encourage you to have a whole school perspective. So if you're going to see some changes in your schools, you're going to need to include all of your schools leaders, many of whom are here. Your schools leaders in their various forms are governors, your business managers, your teachers, your students, your staff, parents, local authorities, the local community that your school is a part of. So taking a whole school perspective that brings in everybody, all of the stakeholders that are involved in your school. And then as you do that, within that, you need a passionate, committed few that's complemented by a supportive leadership. So certainly I've seen that's the ingredients for success in churches and in other faith communities. I've been involved a bit in helping set up Eco Synagogue as well, and working in an interfaith context. Having that success comes when you have a committed few who are really going to put that time in and are absolutely passionate. And then those committed few need to have the support of the leadership. Doesn't mean that the leadership has to do everything. In fact, having the committed few often will take the pressure off some of you as you're sitting here thinking, I can't do everything, can't do anything more. So you want those committed few, and then release them and support them. And as you do that, draw in the whole school and have that whole school perspective. Go for the quick wins to build up confidence and encourage people. I would suggest that you don't start off with a huge project that's going to take 5 years or something to get permission for and raise the funds for, and that takes ages and ages and ages. Yes, you can have that in the background, but better actually to focus on some smaller things that you can get done straight away, and things that are very tangible and very visible, and that you can make a bit of a song and a dance about. And that then encourages people to think, oh yeah, actually we can make some changes, we can do something, and it builds confidence. So think about, as you think about your school, ask yourself, what's the low-hanging fruit? What are those quick wins that you can do? And then once you've got some of those under your belt, then you can be thinking about some of those big changes that you want to make as well, because then you'll have the momentum and the confidence to be able to work towards that. So that's holding together the big and the small. But I also want to encourage you to hold together the big and the small in terms of the kind of individual lifestyle things that you can do, both in your own lives, and I'd really encourage you to be thinking about that as a school community, but in your school lives. So whether it's swapping pencils and pens for ones that aren't entirely plastic or that are reusable, or whatever it might be, those different individual things that you will do in your schools, complement those with the big things, not just the big projects, but the big outward facing things that look more towards the political realm. So I'd really encourage you to get political in your schools. Ask your MP to come in to talk to the children about how they're going to respond to the climate crisis, about how they're holding the government responsible. How are they ensuring that the world your school children are growing up into is going to be one that allows them to flourish and to thrive within a thriving natural world and not face a climate crisis? Hold a day where you write letters to your MP, or you write letters to the government, to the Prime Minister, where you write letters, get engaged in COP26. So hold the political with the everyday things that you can do in your school. And I'd encourage you as faith schools to undergird all of that with prayer. Prayer is fundamentally important. I believe that prayer changes things. I really genuinely do. And through my work at Tear Fund, I've seen that in a whole number of ways. In fact, looking back to the Paris Agreement, the really significant one that we're now coming back to and building on at Glasgow, the Paris Agreement was the most significant agreement because it was the one time when all of the nations, 197, came together to agree to keep warming to below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5. And I had the privilege recently for a book that I was writing for the Archbishop of Canterbury to interview a woman called Christiana Figueras, who was one of the architects of the Paris Climate Agreement. And sadly, off camera, it was after we'd finished filming, just in conversation, she said to me, without the faith groups, there would be no Paris Agreement. And I don't think she's a woman of faith, but she recognised that around the Paris COP talks, the faith communities really galvanised themselves. There were prayers, there were walks, there were pilgrimages, there was all sorts. Prayer changes things. So hold together the big and the small, the everyday with the political, undergird all of it with prayer. And finally, just a word of encouragement that this isn't always about doing new things. Often it's about doing the same things, but doing them a bit differently. So yes, we want to have some of those big projects that are going to make the big differences, the solar panels and the heat source, air source heat pumps and so on. But sometimes it's simply about being creative and doing the things that we do, but changing them to do them slightly differently. So some tips that I hope you can take forward into your discussion next as you go into breakout groups, but more importantly from here into your school communities as you look at how can we respond to the climate crisis? How can we help our school community to respond? And how together can we act to make a difference and to impact on the climate crisis and to play our part in responding to God's call to be looking after other people and taking care of his world. I'm going to pause there. Thank you. Thank you for giving me your attention.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was truly inspiring and a lot to think about. So I think those breakout rooms now will be really, really valuable because not only did you take us back to the root of why we need to do this, but also there were some fantastic suggestions at the end about how schools can start to tackle these issues. So we will put you now into your breakout rooms again for about another 15 minutes to share what you're already doing. And as Ruth said, to talk about what you might like to do moving forward.
Welcome back, everybody. It's great that you're all there. I can't see you, but I hope that you can see me. And we will finish on the dot of 3 o'clock, I think. Just a final reminder about the cathedral event in November, and governors as well as teachers and school leaders, and indeed anybody else who you think would find that helpful, please come. This association that we're launching is not a membership association where you pay a fee and you get a membership card. Rather, it's a group of people who are going to work with us and with the Board of Education to put on a series of events and opportunities, as well as offering mentoring and encouragement and all sorts of other resources that we can think about as we go ahead. So it's an open network as much as it's and it's not a closed association. We're going to send you at some point next week, we're aiming to do it by Wednesday, the recording of today's, at least input part of today's conference, so that you can share that within your school. So we're going to send it to each school that's paid to be here today. It won't be generally available on the website, but please feel free to share that with other members of your teams, whether they be in the staff room or on the governing body. We will also ask you at some point in the next week to offer some very quick feedback to us that will help us in planning future events, and as well as asking you whether there are things that you might be doing or changing the way you do some things in the light of what we've discovered from our various inputters. I want to thank particularly the 4 head teachers who offered the case studies, which was a wide-ranging set of things. We could have asked 138 of you to share a case study, because we know that everybody has been working at wellbeing in different ways and will continue to do so. And it is really helpful for us in planning. If there are things that you are either doing or think that you can't do, but maybe we can work together to do, that will help further promote wellbeing, Carrie works with a small group of head teachers pondering those very things, and amongst that group are people who've contributed today. So I think we can end there, and I'm just going to say a final prayer and a very warm thanks to all of you for spending your day with us online. And we very much hope that this time next year we will be able to meet face to face. Wherever you go, God is sending you. Wherever you are, God has put you there. He has a purpose in your being there. Christ, who indwells you, has something he wants to do through you and where you are. Believe this and go in his grace and love and power. Amen.